it was close enough, at least, that another scholar, he's a non-Latter-day Saint scholar who did his thesis on the Book of Moses at University of Durham. He said the name Mahaway, variously transliterated as Mahway, Mahui, et cetera, in Book of Giants, and the name Mahujah and Mahijah in the Book of Moses, remember he's a non-Latter-day Saint, represent the strongest similarity between the Latter-day Saint revelations on Enoch and the pseudepigraphal books of Enoch. You're assuming that it's related to Mehujael, but we don't know that. We only have these English things, so it could just as well be related to the H in Mahaway. Authenticity perspective, the Mahujah is definitely, as long as you discount the H as a scribal error, is definitely more plausible in this instance.
As a correspondence to the name Mahaway, had rather than if he had just copied the name Mehujael and had the two different variants, that wouldn't be as strong a correspondence to Mahway in the Book of Giants.
That's right.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with Mirth, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and truth claims. This episode, I brought back scholar and researcher Jeff Bradshaw, and we're going to be talking about the Book of Enoch, and more specifically, we're going to be talking about a correspondence in the Book of Enoch with a named character in the Book of Moses named Mahujah. Well, there's two different variants of the name Mahijah and Mahujah, which we're going to get into, and a correspondence with a character, a giant, in the Book of Giants called Mahaway. And if you haven't watched the previous interview that we did on the Book of Enoch, we talked about the different Enochic documents in Enoch's pseudepigrapha. We talked about different thematic and specific correspondences to Joseph Smith's Book of Enoch as well. But this episode, we're going to be specifically diving into the correspondence between Mahijah in Joseph Smith's Book of Enoch and Mahaway, and also addressing maybe some of the criticisms that I've got a friend called Tyler Perry, who has a YouTube channel, Perry Ekamai, and he did a response to Brett McDonald's video on the Book of Enoch, and he brought up some points related to, you know, the Mahujah Mahaway connection, and Colby Townsend as well. It's an article, you know, with some points. So I thought, like, hey, we should do a deep dive into this to see, is this still a strong correspondence? Is this a plausible connection, or can this be undermined? And you've also done some articles addressing some of the things that we're going to get into as well. But I'm excited to have you back.
Good to be here. Really enjoy it.
Awesome. I'm also going to promote this book because I hadn't read it whenever we did our last episode, but as soon as we did it, I ordered the book, and it's called Enoch and the Gathering of Zion. So this is around 200 and, I don't know, 70 pages or so if someone wants to dive deeper into this topic. But we're not going to talk about a lot of the different correspondences, you know, between the Book of Giants or between, you know, second or third Enoch and the Book of Moses. This episode is going to be mostly focused on Mahujah and Mahway, but maybe at the end we'll touch on the Book of Giants.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Is there anything you want to say in opening before we dive into your presentation, or will we just dive in?
No, I'll just say I've spilled a lot of ink and a lot of thought on Enoch, and I have to say it's been great to review it again this time, just because I realized how much I love not only the you know, the spiritual aspects of it, but the story is so inspiring. You know, Enoch is a full biography. We don't even get that of most of the Old Testament characters, let alone the ones in the early chapters of the Bible and the Book of Moses. So it's a thrill to go
Yeah.
back to our friend Enoch and to be inspired by him again.
Oh, and one quick question on this. Do you feel like the Book of Enoch is something that in sort of faithful scholarship and apologetic circles, there's not enough attention or enough of a deep dive done in sort of the Enochic literature, like other than, you know, Hugh Nibley, you know, back in like the, you know, 70s and 80s, and you've done lots of great research and work, but often in apologetics, I don't hear too much talk about the Book of Enoch. There's way more focus on like Book of Mormon scholarship or things to do with church history, but do you feel like it's neglected a little bit, and would you like to see there being more sort of research and scholarship on the Book of Enoch and Joseph Smith's Enoch?
You're singing my song. Yeah, there's a couple of things that are unfortunate, I think, that make it that way. I don't blame people because on the one hand, unfortunately, Nibley just wrote one book on it based on his series in church magazines. And then he went on and really did a lot of temple and Egyptian stuff after that, and never really went back and revisited it. So, he's kind of been the one for keeping these subjects alive. And secondly, it's super complicated. There's all these different documents from different languages and so forth. And it really takes some dedicated looking at it to make any sense of it. So I think that's another reason why people may have shied away. But I'm hoping that your episode here and our advocacy of that kind of thing will let people make it seriously, and see that there's more to it than the wonderful work that Nibley started that can be built upon.
Yeah, I think your book as well, it's definitely taken into account a lot of the latest research and scholarship. So it's a great read for a deep dive. And I'm also going to link articles that you've done, I think, with Interpreter and BYU Studies, I believe with Ryan Daly and maybe Matthew Bowen, in a couple where you have gone through a lot of the ancient connections, and one specifically where you're responding to Colby Townsend. I think a lot of what we're going to go through today, if people want to go to the full argument, they can read the articles, and I'll link them.
That's great.
All right. Right. So let's dive into your presentation, and maybe you could open up talking about the Mahijah Mahujah Mahaway connection and when it was first discovered.
Right. Okay. So I entitled this Enoch, Mahujah, and Hugh Nibley. And because we kind of start a little bit after we do a brief introduction with Hugh Nibley's greatest discovery, or most well-known discovery, I guess we could say, and then we come back to him at the end, and I hope that'll be interesting for people.
Yeah.
As you said, there's a couple places where you can read more in depth. You can take the 3,000-page version, and in God's Image and Likeness series, of which there's a new volume of that that's just come out on Abraham. Or you can take the shorter route of actual books that you can carry that are small enough to carry, that has a lot of the meat of those things, including the second one you mentioned in the beginning series. So hoping you get into that. And as you said, just to make this a little bit more visual, there were two articles actually responding to some very thoughtful pieces that Colby Townsend did that touched on issues related to the source documents of the Book of Enoch. So the one on the right, you can get on Interpreter along with the other ones you're going to post. So recommend that as well, especially for a deep dive on the names. We're going to have to just run through a lot of the arguments and simplify them here a little bit. And so if I misstate things or you think I'm being a bit too glib, urge you to go and read this article and the part one as well to a lesser extent, just to give me a little bit more chance to get into the details than we're going to be able to today.
Absolutely. Sounds good.
Okay. So I always like to throw in some fun facts. Here's a fun fact I want to throw in here. I love that painting on the cover of the Enoch book by Frederick James Shields. Just a very meticulous artist of who we have very few remaining works. It's actually an oil painting of something that was a stained glass window in an English church that unfortunately was bombed and destroyed during the Civil War. So all we have is a few remnants, obviously during the Civil War, during the First World War, a few remnants of his work that survived as these oil paintings. Now, the thing that you'll notice here is something very interesting to the side of Enoch, just a bit of trivia here, that discusses that, has a saying in Latin there, ecce venit Domine. And one thing I didn't notice till after the Enoch book was written is that is an actual play on words. What ecce venit Domine means is, behold, he cometh, O Lord. And that's, of course, very appropriate to Enoch's ascent to heaven. You see the Lord's arms outstretched, welcoming you up through this multi-veiled world in different colors. You see the snake below representing serpent, his feet on the world, but he's escaping the serpent without harm. And then what is interesting, though, that the artist has done that I completely overlooked until recently, is that is actually a play on the Latin term ecce venit Dominus, which is behind the Greek translation of the English words, "Behold, the Lord cometh," actually a quote from Jude 1:14, citing First Enoch 1:9. So it's cool. You notice the E in Domine is kind of hidden. And that to me is a signal that the artist knew what he was doing by thinking of that wordplay, which many people in his time would have recognized for Dominus, that he's doing wordplay between Enoch's ascent and the Lord's descent in the last times. So that was pretty cool to me.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Interesting. Yeah, I
Okay.
never heard of that before.
So here we are. Another piece of trivia. We see lots of pictures of Enoch around. We don't know what he looked like, but here is something much closer to Enoch's time that you may recognize from the book. That's from the Manichean cosmology painting, and it refers to another character we're going to be talking today, namely Mahujah. And I'll say something at the end about the Manichean cosmology painting. I don't know if we covered that in the previous episode, but I do want to say
I
a
think
few
we
things related
did.
to that. Okay. Then we'll do quickly then, and this might correspond at least to something that we read about that says, "As I was journeying and stood in the place, Mahujah and I cried unto the Lord." That's Enoch speaking. "There came a voice out of heaven saying, Turn ye and get upon the Mount Simeon." I note that this is from the Book of Moses in the OT1 manuscript, which is a little different than the one we have in our canonical scriptures. Here it makes it clear in the original manuscript that instead of the place being called Mahujah, it was a character named Mahujah, and it was Mahujah and Enoch who prayed together. And then there's more to the story we can talk about later.
So you're saying
So
in the Book of Moses, that as we have it in our scriptures, it's referring to Mahujah as a place name, but you're saying in the original manuscript, you believe it was Mahujah and I cried unto the Lord, referring to Enoch and the person Mahujah?
that's right. So I've taken those words in the first Old Testament transcription from Joseph Smith's oral dictation, and I've punctuated them, and it makes more sense in the way I've done than to actually emend it, as has been done in our
Because it wouldn't have been
current.
punctuated in the original manuscript when it comes for the Book of Moses, similar to with the Book of Mormon, there wasn't punctuation.
It isn't just punctuation. There was, I think, a second and maybe some other things left out. So they had to leave out some words to have it make sense because they were sure that place referred to Mahujah. And you say, why Mahujah and not Mahijah? Because it's the one place it is. And why are there two versions of the name? We'll get into that later.
Right.
So,
Okay.
so yeah, so if you go to compare that with your scriptural thing, you'll see that there's actually some words that are in this version, or at least one word, I think, at least one of the ands that's left out, and it makes more sense the way it is here in my view.
Okay.
Okay. So what is Moses 6 and 7? Just a brief review. It's the Joseph Smith translation Genesis account of Enoch. It's in our Pearl of Great Price. We think of it as being kind of a separate book, but it's really part of the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. It's highly original. I like the way Carmack talks about it. It's not pseudo-biblical or biblical or Joseph Smith's own pattern. It really has a whole different style. And as I've kind of looked at the style, I think of it as being a separate document that was kind of plopped into the Book of Moses. Of course, it's kind of got a little transitional text around it, but it really looks like an independent unit at the beginning to me. According to Joseph Smith, new revelations made it apparent that significant items were removed from the Bible or lost before it was compiled. And the interesting thing about these two chapters, they're produced at record speed, even for the Joseph Smith translation. Expansion from 5 verses in the Bible to over 100 verses, estimated just to have occupied just a few days of Joseph Smith's attention. I couldn't do that. As smart as you are, I don't know that you could do that. I don't know that anybody could have it conform so well to ancient documents as we would if we tried to do that artificially.
Hmm.
So there we are. That's the Book of Moses.
And as
Okay.
well, like I know we talked about this, I'm pretty sure in our previous interview, but there's not many verses in the Bible that refer to Enoch. Like he's spoken about briefly in the genealogy in the book of Genesis, and it says that he sort of he talked with God, talks about him, going up to heaven. I think there's a verse in the book of Jude and maybe one other reference, but there's not a whole lot about Enoch from the Bible that we have.
Absolutely. 5 verses in Genesis and then a few verses in Jude, quoting First Enoch, and that's it.
Mhm.
Yeah. So this is amazing and wonderful and inspiring to me. So let's get to the names then. What is Nibley's best known discovery about the Book of Moses and ancient Enoch texts? And I think you know the answer to that. What would you say?
It would probably be the Book of Giants and the name Mahujah with Mahaway, I imagine.
That's right. So there you have it. Um, and let me just give a little bit of that story of how he came across that. It was 1976 and 77. He was writing a series in the Ensign magazine, the main church magazine called that during the time, now called the Liahona everywhere in the world. And he dashed over off long, heavily footnoted articles, one after another, in a series about the ancient Enoch manuscripts in Moses 6 and 7 that eventually appeared in his book on Enoch the prophet with very few changes. As he was finishing the very last article in the series, he received just in time the book that's shown on the right. That's an anxiously awaited volume describing the fragments of the Book of Giants. Those fragments came from were Aramaic rather than Hebrew, and they came from Qumran in Cave 4. And everybody was excited, him the most, and he just had a little bit of time to spend on it, but really did some neat things with it in his article. And pretty much everything that we've heard about Mahijah and Mahujah, pretty much from an apologetic perspective, other than what's been done recently, has come from that.
Right, so this is where it originated. So am I right in thinking the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the late 1940s, but was it not published until the 1970s? Is this was when he first came across it?
Well, it started becoming the good comment. They started being published in the 1950s. Of course, they were studied almost immediately, but
Right.
there were different caves and they were discovered incrementally, the different manuscripts. You see the 4Q in front of it. It was not the first cave that was discovered. That was one of the 1Q documents that came from the first cave. It was the fourth cave they eventually discovered. And I don't, it was 1948, I think, when they discovered that cave. But there was no English translation till 1976 of this particular document.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So, there you see from Nibley's own book, within that red oval up above, his own circling the name, uh, 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 well, I'll say Mahaway. It's Mahaway, Mahujah, and I'll say that just for everybody's benefit, that there's a lot of ways of transliterating the Hebrew, and so you see it put all sorts of ways, and some of the differences you see between the Book of Mormon, Book of Moses spellings in English, and the Book of the Giant spellings are not due to anything in the underlying Hebrew necessarily, or Aramaic in this case, but due to just the way, on the one hand, people have interpreted the consonants into English, like the J or a Y, and in other cases, the vowel, which was everything which had no vowels in the original Hebrew or Aramaic. And on the other hand, in the Book of Moses, it kind of varied depending on how Joseph Smith tried to pronounce it and the scribes tried to hear it and write it down. So you can't infer too much. We'll get more into this later about the underlying. You don't want to infer too much about the underlying text um, based on how it's transliterated in English. And I think, though, most scholars would agree that the Qumran text, MHWY, we'll say in English just to keep it easy, could be translated Mahaway, Mahujah, Mehujael, or as it is in Greek and other ways, corresponds to what would be Mahijah, MHYY, or if you take the view, it's a het instead of a hey in the H, MHWY, and Mahujah with a WY at the end instead of a YY. So there's the basis for what we're talking about. So if I talk about Mahaway, you'll know I'm talking about the Qumran version of it, but it could just as well be something closer to Mahijah or Mahujah, in my opinion. And if I talk about Mahijah and Mahujah for the underlying Greek or Aramaic versions, it could be something very close to the Qumran version.
Right. So you're
So,
saying basically, because obviously I don't understand linguistics super well.
mhm.
It's complicated. I'm not an expert, but the root word for Mahaway is MHWY. There's no vowels in Hebrew, but as scholars transliterate it, you're saying Mahujah is a very plausible transliteration of Mahaway. And
Right.
then for Mahijah, you have MHYY, which a transliteration of that would reasonably be Mahijah. And I think you've got a slide in this, but my understanding is in the Book of Genesis, you have a name character called Mehujael. Is that correct?
Yeah.
But there's two
Mhm.
different variants of that name in the underlying Hebrew. But I believe it's the same name in the English, but with one it's MHYY and MHWY. So almost like two different variants in the Hebrew of the same name. Is that correct?
That's correct. And we'll definitely go into that. So that's a good preview to that. The other thing to notice, you notice I've got an or on the Book of Mormon versions because we don't have Book of Moses versions because we don't have, an ancient language version of those names. It could be a hey or it could be a chet behind it because all we have is the English. And I'll say a little bit more about that later.
Okay.
So that's why I've
Yeah,
got
that's
the
one of
or
the
there.
critiques that
Mhm.
Colby brings up.
Yep, exactly. Regardless of these things, there are some now non-Latter-day Saint scholars who agree, non-Latter-day Saint scholars that agree that Joseph Smith could not have simply invented this character and have, as we'll see, come up with some amazing backstories about how that could have taken place. Let's get into that a little bit. What is the Book of Giants? Just real quickly to review that for those of you who saw the previous episode. And as we mentioned earlier, it's a Dead Sea Scrolls account in Aramaic found in 1948 and published in English in 1976. But there are other fragments of the Book of Giants in 6 languages that were found with the writings of Mani, founder of a religious sect called Manichaeism, published in English in 1943. And they spread all through Asia, even into the Far East, even as far as Japan. He had an amazing corps of missionaries. And so, from the time of his early writings in the early centuries of the Christian era to our day, you'll find fragments of Manichaeism all through Asia and the Far East because of his missionary work.
Can I ask a quick
And
question on that? Um,
yeah,
because I've read through the Book of Giants, but I've not looked at these other fragments in the other languages. Are they identical or are they similar, but they're obviously in different languages? Like, how similar would they be to the Aramaic Book of Giants?
that's a great question. Um, because both books are fragmentary, there's a lot of there's some differences of opinion, especially on some parts, about the way those fragments fit together. But if we assume that they go in more or less the same order, those stories are more or less the same. However, happily, because we're missing so many fragments in the Qumran Aramaic version, the Manichean version actually fills in some gaps in there. And because we can kind of make some good guesses about where those gaps are, we can put them in their proper places and vice versa when we go back and forth between them. But apart from language differences and some perhaps in some of the manuscripts, some paraphrasing. Um, uh, they're not identical, but pretty good, pretty good resemblance to each other.
Okay,
Just like
gotcha.
we have different versions of the same book in the Bible, more or less, with
Right.
some gap.
Makes sense.
Okay, so some things to know about the Book of Giants. It references giants, but do we really find much about giants, the Book of Giants? The answer is no. We find it's a story of the Gibborim, mighty men. This is a term you'll find in Hebrew, and you'll find mighty men referenced of that sort in the Old Testament. It really the Gibor is the name for man. Giborim means just mighty men, and almost that the double B in there is like saying, "Oh, this is a real manly man. instead of Gibor, it's Gibor, so it gives it a little bit extra punch to have the two B's in there. So this is
Extra
a
oomph.
He-Man, a oomph. That's right. Here's what Ida Froelich, a German scholar, says about the supposition, and some people still hang on to that idea, which I think is pretty outmoded now. But she and other scholars have concluded as follows. There's no sign that these beings had a mixed human and animal nature. The name Giborim refers to their state, armed mighty men. The term does not involve the idea of a superhuman or gigantic stature. It was the Greek translation that introduced a term gigantes, involving the notion of superhuman stature. So some Greek fragments of English of these Enoch manuscripts that started referring them to as giants carried over inaccurately this Near Eastern term of Giborim. Okay.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So it's really just
So
mighty men, mighty armed men or warriors. It's not actually talking about giants in the narrative.
yes, and so why this is important for our discussion of the Book of Moses is that you see one reference to giants in kind of an oblique verse about a battle, two giants, but otherwise they're just ordinary folks, kind of rude, warlike folks, which kind of fits the thing, but they're not giants. And so it kind of says the basic characters in the story correspond in a greater way than you'd think than if you thought, oh, this whole book is about giants. Okay.
Okay.
Now, the other thing to know about the Giborim, some people say they were sages and culture heroes, but the best scholarship on that says no, they are warriors obsessed with hunting prowess and human bloodshed. And I'll talk to show you a couple of the good studies on that in a minute. So Ron Hendel, a great Old Testament scholar who's just finishing up the second volume of the new Anchor Bible series on Genesis, pretty authoritative voice, says, according to the Hebrew Bible, history comes out of Mesopotamia, but it was a dubious and shameful history. The ancient past in these stories offers implicit commentary on Mesopotamian civilization and empire in the present, colored by transgression, hubris, and a desire to rebel. So there's a feeling that the story of Enoch and the characters in it came out of ancient Mesopotamia, which isn't necessarily inconsistent with our view of the Bible, as we'll talk about more, and that we're not talking about biblical heroes here. We're talking about folks that the Hebrews didn't like very much, and they paint them, perhaps accurately, as folks colored by transgression, hubris, and a desire to rebel. Okay.
Okay.
So that's the kind of characters we're talking about. You can read the Book of Moses and Book of Giants and see if that fits your view of that. So we ought to think of people like Samson. You see his animal he's just killed behind him, and killing one of the Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. And you see Nimrod here, the mighty hunter, and of course he's considered one of these wild. He's considered a wild man like Ishmael is, and I'll say more about that term in a minute. And that's the kind of picture you ought to have about Enoch's adversaries in the Book of Moses, as well as his adversaries in the Book of Giants, I believe. So here are the two sources I promised, both by Gregory Mobley, or maybe it's Mobley. I don't know. I've never heard it pronounced, but he's my go-to source on what he calls the empty man in a wonderful book about the heroic tradition of ancient Israel, which in this case means something that came from Mesopotamia, and the wild man in the Bible in the ancient Near East. Anything you want to say about any of this, or anything that maybe I should clarify a little further?
So obviously you're bringing up the reference to the wild man because in the Book of Moses, Enoch is sort of sarcastically referred to as, a wild man has come among us. And I believe in the Book of Giants, it's one of the Gibborim that talks about himself being a wild man, which is quite a sort of like unique phrase and term. I think other than Ishmael in the Bible, the term wild man isn't used very frequently. But you're saying this is something that might stem back, anciently in the ancient Near Eastern traditions and texts, and you would see that reference to in the Book of Moses of Enoch being a wild man, and it's showing up in the Book of Giants. Would you see that as both stemming from an ancient source or tradition?
Yes, absolutely. So you're a great You could be given this yourself. In fact, I'll just digress a
No,
little
definitely
bit on
not.
this because I think it's good there, because the wild man really first, if you go back to it, it really is a wild ass man. And you may remember that from your own reading study of that, Stephen. And so that refers to the onager, the mule of the desert, the donkey of the desert, just untamable, lone warrior, violent. And these people were compared to them, Ishmael, as you say in Genesis, as well as references elsewhere in Near Eastern literature. And as you say, this is somebody much closer to Nimrod, taking lions down with his bare hands, or Samson, uh, mighty hunter, than it is to anything else. And so I take that reference when they refer to Enoch as a wild man as being totally sarcastic, just as from the context as Daffy Duck in refers to Elmer Fudd in that famous Looney Tunes cartoon. He calls him my little Nimrod. And of course, he wasn't thinking of Elmer Fudd being a mighty hero. He was being totally sarcastic, just as these wild men were referring sarcastically to Enoch, in my view.
A very quick question on this, because I remember when my friend Tyler did a response to the Book of Enoch, he pushed back a little bit on this correspondence. Because if in, for example, the Book of Giants, it referred to Enoch as a wild man, I think that would make it like that's a really, really strong correspondence. His little pushback was because it was one of the giants of the Gibberim referring to himself as a wild man, whereas in the Book of Moses, it's other people who are mocking Enoch, calling him a wild man, and he saw that as like, are we sort of stretching this correspondence a bit? Anything you'd want to say as a quick response to that, and why you still think it's a significant correspondence?
I think you have to look at the overall context, and again, more of that's in the book than we can go into here. I definitely think if you look at the description of Enoch from start to finish, you'll see what kind of character he is. Robert Alter, who wrote The Art of Biblical Narrative, for example, tells us to pay very close attention to how a character is introduced in Old Testament writing. And this is very true for the book of Moses as it is for in Genesis or any of the Old Testament writings. How does it start out? Well, he's very mild-mannered. He's slow of speech. People mock him there. Remember, they make fun of him. He thinks of himself as a child, a lad, by
A
the way,
lot.
another term. And he's definitely not the sort of person that the gift the Lord gives him there is not the power of a sword or of a mighty man to go out and overpower, out wrestle, and out hunt his enemies. He gives him the power of speech. And so the twist at the end of his story, again, it's the thematic argument I'm making, is not that he becomes a Gibor like the other ones, but this power of speech is so powerful that his enemies, who have these great swords and are great hunters and great masters of battle, are cowed by the power of his speech. So strong it was. And so that, if you want to make the case that Enoch was a wild man in any other sense, you can do that. But the sense in which it's makes sense thematically in the context of the Book of Moses, looking at first how the character of Enoch is introduced and how it ends up with the power of language being his sword, as it were, it makes sense that this is a sarcastic reference, especially when you look at the other thing they say, the other context of their speech. They're not taking him seriously, you know.
And do you also see the term wild man, except for the reference to, you said it was Ishmael in the Bible, do you
Mhm.
see that as quite a unique term and designation which shows up both in the Book of Giants and in the Book of Moses? And even if they're used slightly differently by a different person, do you see that as like quite a unique phrase we see in both?
I think it's the only time it occurs in the Book of Moses is once here, and the only time it occurs in Genesis, outside of the Latter-day Saint scripture that I can recall right now, is in that story of Ishmael. So it's not something you find everywhere. If I'm mistaken about that, refer to the book, but it's not at all a common term. And it's kind of neat that it shows up here in a story of Enoch in the
Right.
book of Giants, by someone who has ostensibly the properties of a wild man, and that's its unique reference, so far as I can remember, in the book of giants.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get a little bit to that great finding of Nibley and then see how those findings held up over time. First of all, a couple of things a little closer to his time. Um, I don't think we got into this earlier. Maybe we did, maybe we didn't, but I think it's a story worth repeating. The scholar Matthew Black on the left, who is a collaborator with Millock on the book that we saw on the first English translation of the Book of Giants, the Aramaic Book of Giants, came to the U.S. to take up residence at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study about the same time Nibley made his discovery. I thought that was quite a coincidence. While Black was giving a lecture at Cornell University, a Latter-day Saint doctoral candidate, Gordon C. Thomason, was present. And I just feel such a thrill that I was able to hear Gordon himself relate this story. We had when the Enoch scholar George Nicholsburg came to BYU, was hosted by Jack Welch there. Gee, I can't even remember who that was, but some years back, I was on a panel in the moot courtroom at BYU with Nicholsburg, some other scholars, Enoch scholars, including David Larson, and Gordon Thomason was on the panel as well. And he related this story that I'm going to tell you about his encounter with Matthew Black. When I heard it, I said, "You have to write it down." And so he wrote it down. A short time later, he passed away. So I'm very grateful that we have it because it tells how seriously a great Enoch scholar, one who specifically dealt with the Qumran Book of Giants, felt about the correspondences that Nibley had found. But he had a different explanation. So anyway, Thomas recounts, and I'm going to quote his story. Waiting until the last lecture crowd had disappeared, I asked Professor Black if he was familiar with Joseph Smith's Enoch text. He said he was not, but was interested. He first asked if it was identical or similar to First Enoch. I told him it was not, which it isn't. We've talked about that before. First Enoch is much more distant to the themes of the Book of Moses than the other Enoch texts.
And it's also significantly longer. It's about 170 pages. And you see, other than, I think, the Son of Man, which is, I think, a really interesting motif in 1 Enoch and Jerusalem's Book of Enoch, you see the parallels a little bit more loose. And at least with the Book of Giants, it's like 3 pages and it's more dense in thematic parallels than 1 Enoch.
Well said. Yeah, the Book of Parables is the one worth looking at for Book of Moses. You may remember that the first Enoch is actually, most people think, composed as a composite book of 5 parts. The Book of Parables, where it goes into the Son of Man and his eventual coming to earth again, I'd say has
I
some
find that
great.
really interesting because you don't see Joseph using the term that I'm aware of, Son of Man, super frequently in his revelations or in his other scriptural productions, but it's repeated quite a lot in the Book of Enoch, in his Book of Moses, and it's interesting that shows up a lot in 1 Enoch.
Absolutely. You're saying my tune. And the other themes that they mention associated with the Son of Man, and you have Nicholsburg himself, the translator, saying it himself. He doesn't say this about the correspondence, but he lists the themes that go with the Son of Man, and they correspond quite well with the ones that Enoch talks about when he has his prophecy of Christ in Moses 6. So,
And you also
yeah.
don't think it seems probable. I know Colby Townsend did an article on the accessibility of 1 Enoch and or could some of these ideas have circulated in his milieu, but it certainly doesn't seem likely or probable that Joseph would have had access to 1 Enoch. And it's just very interesting that the Son of Man motif and theme is throughout the Book of Enoch.
Yeah, I think the most that Joseph probably would have been familiar with was, a newspaper report of the discovery or the publication of the Book of Enoch, very sketchy stuff. But that was not the headline making stuff. The headline making stuff for First Enoch were all these fantastic tales about these, in this case, really giants and warriors that were terrible, half men, half gods that came to Earth in a very different sort of field than you get elsewhere, in a very different field from the Book of Moses. So yeah, to me, it was pretty improbable.
Okay.
So anyway, he asked if it was similar or identical to the first Enoch, and then continuing with Thomason's own account, he said, I told him it was not, and then proceeded to recite some of the correlations Dr. Nibley had just shown with Millock and Black's own and others Qumran and Ethiopic Enoch materials. He, meaning Dr. Black became quiet. When I got to Mahujah, he raised his hand in a please pause gesture and was silent. Finally, he acknowledged that the place name of Mahujah, in that time, he's calling it a place name because Thomason only had access to the canonical version of Moses rather than the Old Testament one manuscript, the very original manuscript, where to me it's much more probable that Mahujah was a companion to
Right, a
Enoch.
character name as opposed to a place name. But even
Right.
with it being presented to him as a place name, he still thinks it's quite a striking correlation.
Absolutely. Good point. He says that Black said the place name of Mahujah could not have come from First Enoch. He then formulated a hypothesis on the spot, consistent with his lecture, that, quote, continuing the quote, a member of one of the esoteric groups he had described previously must have survived into the 19th century and, hearing of Joseph Smith, must have brought the group's Enoch text to New York from Italy for the prophet to translate and publish. Pretty creative to do that on the spot, but you'll have to decide
Yeah,
for
it's quite a
yourself how.
creative hypothesis as opposed to just positing that, oh, maybe it's just a coincidence. It's interesting that he thought the correlation was quite strong, that he had to theorize something like that happening.
That it had to have come from some other manuscript. He couldn't have just taken it out of his imagination. Joseph Smith couldn't have taken it out of his imagination.
Mm.
At the end of our conversation, he expressed an interest in seeing more of Hugh's work. I proposed that Black should meet with Hugh and gave him contact information, and he contacted Hugh the same day, as Hugh later confirmed to me. Soon he made a previously trip to Provo, where he met with Hugh for some time. Black certainly knew enough about ancient Hebrew and Aramaic to have recognized, like Nibley, that the unusual names Mahujah and Mahijah were reasonable English equivalents of the similar Book of Judges name. He also would have recognized how unlikely it would have been that these names appeared in a Book of Moses text about Enoch by mere coincidence. However, while at BYU, although Black gave a public lecture, according to Hugh Nibley, he would not answer any questions about the Book of Moses.
Huh.
Um, Now, there's an interesting.
That's a pity.
It's a pity. Well, Nibley, it wasn't for lack of trying. Here's a letter. I don't know if I've shown this to you yet, but it's a great letter that Nibley wrote. Have you seen this before to a brother where he reported himself about his visit with Black?
I don't know. I don't unless it was in the book, but if it wasn't in the book, then I don't think I have.
Okay, may or may not have been there. It's a little bit caustic, and maybe I thought about putting this in here or not because I didn't know if it would reflect a little too caustically on scholarship at the time. But dear brother so and so, I redacted the names.
Hmm.
The map to which he refers has been duly noted and discussed at some length in my forthcoming book. The Oxford edition of the Book of Enoch was edited by Matthew Black and Malek. He should have put Millick. On the week it appeared in 1976, I spent several days with Dr. Black. He was greatly impressed by certain parallels between the Qumran Book of Enoch and Joseph Smith's. When I started asking for explanations, he would switch to other topics, a ploy all too familiar with the Brotherhood, capital B. He is president of the St. Andrews Golf Club in Scotland, the oldest in the world, and greatly preferred talking golf with Billy Casper, and a Latter-day Saint golfer at the time, who also happened to be visiting here, then splitting heads about the Book of Enoch. He did say a number of times, shaking his head in a bemused fashion, someday we'll find out where Joseph Smith got that. Someday a source will turn up. Again, notice his being convinced, according to Nibley, that it had to be a written source, which I doubt not for a moment that a source will show up, since we already have an impressive sampling. I'm afraid it will not be what Brother Black is hoping for. Yours truly, Hugh Nibley.
Hmm.
So there we have it. There's all we have. I wish I had more, but I'm so grateful we have any at all. The letter was due to Steve Whitlock's sleuthing, and the other was due to Gordon Thomas, and then we just have some brief remarks from Hugh Nibley, but not implausible in my view.
Right. So according to Matthew Black, who was one of the scholars who translated the Book of Enoch when it was brought to him by Hugh Nibley, and what was the name of the former gentleman who brought up to him?
Gordon Thomason.
Yeah. He at least thought that correspondence was quite striking and other parallels as well.
That's right. That's right. And frankly, well, let's leave it there because I'll give you one other example of this, a little bit more recent. Um, uh, and I'll just emphasize again that from the point of view of Aramaic and Hebrew, more or less the names are equivalent, more or less, because there's some fluidity to both orthography and pronunciation. Mahaway in the Book of Giants, we're claiming, in its original form, is equivalent to more or less, if you leave out some vowels and some minor variations, or major in the case of the hey and the hate, Mahijah and Mahujah in the Book of Moses. And it was close enough, at least, that another scholar, he's a non-Latter-day Saint scholar who did his thesis on the Book of Moses at University of Durham. He said the name Mahaway, variously transliterated as Mahway, Mahway, et cetera, in Book of Giants, and the name Mahujah and Mahijah in the Book of Moses, remember he's a non-Latter-day Saint, represent the strongest similarity between the Latter-day Saint revelations on Enoch and the pseudepigraphal books of Enoch, specifically Book of Giants. So he said it's the best evidence for the Book of Moses anywhere in any of the Enoch literature.
Is this the master's thesis written by, is it Salvatore Cirillo? Is this the
That's the
quote?
one.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a quote from his thesis. And then he goes on to argue, I don't have the exact wording for this, that essentially he thinks that Joseph Smith must have copied it from the Book of Giants in his thesis. He says this because it couldn't have come to him any other way. So this is evidence of plagiarism from Joseph Smith. What he didn't really explain, and maybe he made a mistake. I think he must have made a mistake because it was, so clear to us that how could a document that was not discovered until 1948 have informed Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Moses, which was done in 1830. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point, because I remember reading through his thesis, and one was the Son of Man motif, but he was positing that he saw that correspondence to be such a strong theme that he says it shows Joseph must have somehow had access to one Enoch. And even if you were to grant that, when it comes to Mahujah and Mahaway, which I think he does say he sees that as the strongest correspondence, the transliteration both of the name but also the role. But he's saying, well, this shows he must have had access to the Book of Giants. But as you said, it wasn't discovered till over 100 years later. So Joseph couldn't have had access to this.
Well said. Well said. With all due respect to Salvatore, and he did some good scholarship, but that was
Suppose he's making
something that
an
argued.
argument in
Yeah.
our favor in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. It works. It worked in our favor in that case. Yeah. Okay, so let's go a little bit further and talk about the more recent questions raised by Colby Townsend, which we refer to in this interpreter article, and to a lesser degree, especially having to do with Emma's error that I'll talk about, is more filled out in part one of
I'll
these.
just say briefly that I appreciate, because some of the strongest evidence that I see in a variety of topics, I want to see critics engage with and just see what their responses are to. And I'm grateful that Colby has at least engaged with this and provided some, critiques or some pushbacks, because I've had a few discussions with an ex-Mormon, and we've talked about various topics, and we both said about each other that sometimes steel can help sharpen steel and just refine your positions, or to like, oh, that's a good point. Let me dive deeper into this to, better understand this, so it can help you to refine your position and dive deeper.
Absolutely. I could have almost put, Colby, so much he did actually contribute and do some back and forth dialogue with us. He's a friend I've known for many years.
Mm-hmm.
How much he contributed, I would have put him in as a co-author under normal circumstances, except I don't think he would have wanted to be seen as accepting the claims that we were making. But certainly that dialogue sharpened the steel for us in a good way. And I think it was a very respectful, and is still a respectful dialogue that we've had over the years.
Good.
So
Yeah, that's what you want.
Yep. So let's look at a few of the things that have been brought up, and then you can help me fill in if there's other questions or thoughts you've heard that aren't covered enough. It was an error by Emma, and this was something brought up in the part one article of this series. Was it a borrowing from Adam-Clarke, a Bible scholar in the early 1800s, contemporary more or less with Joseph Smith? Were there different roots behind the Book of Giants and the Book of Moses names? We'll dive in a little deeper more what I claimed really in a facile sort of way earlier. And then, are the names in the Book of Moses more similar to the Bible than the Book of Giants? Because in a sense, Colby's arguments implicitly argue for that. So we'll take those one by one. They're kind of in order just to manage the dependencies because you, having heard one, two, and three, you'll understand four a little better. So that's the reason I've taken them in the order that they're here, hopefully.
Okay.
And I'll go over very quickly, hopefully not too glibly. And if you want details, we can either talk a little bit more or we can you can do the reading.
So Emma
So
was the scribe for the original Book of Enoch. I assumed it would have been Oliver Carter or someone else, but it was Emma.
Emma, you're right. For the first part of that, I'm trying to remember. The exact dates are escaping me, but she was for chapter 6 especially, and then I think by about chapter 7, sometime in chapter 7, I think it was early in chapter 7, then Sidney Rigdon came to Joseph Smith, and he became the scribe after that. It was pretty tough for Emma to manage everything she was managing, plus be a scribe.
Uh-huh.
So but Moses 6, where Mahijah first appears, was definitely um, uh, her writing.
Okay.
So Colby argues that the variants Mahijah and Mahujah are explicable as an error by Emma, and essentially simplifying it a little bit, I'm just going to say that it's the general idea, as I understood it, is that she first wrote a U in this version of Mahijah you're seeing. He conjectured, and then she mistakenly dotted the U as an I. Um, and there is, and I'll say something about that later. But there is one of the 100 I's that appear in Emma Smith's dictation. There is one instance of those 100 where she did actually dot an I, and you can see. I'll say more about why I think that happened a little bit later. So it's not completely out of the question, but that's those two circumstances are what he points to. And so he concludes that it's easier to believe that Joseph Smith borrowed the single name Mahujah from Mehujael in Genesis 4:18 than to believe he received the two name variants Mahijah and Mahujah by inspiration. That's the basic argument.
Okay, so let me
That
just make
makes
sure I'm understanding this. So
Yeah.
he's basically saying that so in the Book of Moses text that we have, it's Mahijah is the first name that shows up, and then Mahujah, and he's saying that it seems most likely that it's the same name, it's not two different variants, it's Mahujah both times, but the first spelling of the Mahijah that we have here, that even though there's a dot above it looking like an I, that really it was a U, and sometimes Emma would have her U's look like eyes. Is that correct?
Well, sometime in one case, she did. It's clear that she did dot a U, and
Okay.
he's in this case, this U, this seeming I for us, could be a U. He claims.
Okay. And obviously you're going to address this. But let's just say if he were correct on this, because you're saying that this could preserve two different variants of the same name. But if he were correct, it should be Mahujah both times. Would that do much to undermine the sort of the transliteration of Mahaway, or like would there be any significance to that, even if you were to agree with his points here?
Good point. Good question. It really is not very consequential for the text. In fact, would argue a little bit stronger if there was only one version, if that it would be Mahujah, because Mahujah's with the two Y's at the end, the two Yods at the end, is closer. I'm sorry, the
The WY.
with the WY at the end uh, is the Vav Yod is closer to the Book of Giants than it is to the Bible. But he's trying to make a case for the Mahu because he wants to say that it was, if he can, that it was borrowed from the Bible. So it makes a little stronger case for him to be able to argue, he just borrowed it as a variant of Mehujael. But
Because
for
it'd be
the
strange for him.
overall,
Why would he preserve two different variants of the same name with an I and with a U? But the point you just made, just for any listeners who don't fully understand or fully followed, you're saying that Mahaway, the root is MHWY, and Mahujah would be very much a transliteration of that. So even if it was Mahujah both times, that would still work as a transliteration of Mahaway. And if it was Mahijah, the root would be MHY. MHWY. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So maybe summing up what you just said so well, um, the fact of if it were to prove to be Mahujah, it would strengthen our case for, to a small degree, in the correspondences with the Book of Giants, but it would weaken the case. I'm sorry, but in the case of Colby, it strengthens the case for him because he doesn't believe in a correspondence with the Book of Giants, for that Joseph Smith borrowed it from Mehujael in Genesis.
Right, and it's just one version of the same name because it might be a bit strange under a naturalistic theory to think why would Joseph include two different variants, but if it's oh no, if he's saying oh no, it's just Mahujah both times, he could argue that he's copying Mehujael but just dropping the L, which might be a little bit easier for him to explain.
Very well said.
Okay.
So let's look at the counter argument to that. We argue, okay, here you see two pictures. I'll just look at the pictures first, and then I'll say the words that go with them. Here is in the upper frame is you'll see that the the I or U, and really the width of that little jog that's between the I and the U. And I didn't get into the way she draws her J's, but that's another argument that we could use, but I just don't want to complicate it too much. And down below are two instances of U's in a side-by-side comparison elsewhere. So you can see that the supposed U on the right in Mahijah and the U in mouths are of a very different width and form. And it really, it's to me, just from the width alone, it's narrower than any U she's written elsewhere that we can find in those manuscripts.
Right.
Second, so did I word that clearly?
Yeah, so you're basically saying that in the one that we have here of Mahijah, you're saying it looks more narrow than her other U's if it is a
Yeah.
U as Colby proposes, you're saying it looks a bit more narrow than the other U's she normally does.
Yeah, and it doesn't have much of a rise, you'll notice, either for the rightmost part of the U either. It's pretty flat. It looks to me more like a little jog of some
Hmm.
kind for whatever reason it happened. Now, as to the dot, it's true that she had one dotted I, one dotted U elsewhere in the manuscript. However, it's best explained as a proofreading error because on the line above, there was an is that had a dot on it, and right below it was the U that she dotted. It was as if, it's purely conjectural, but is a, what should I say, at least a consistent story, as if she was going through the manuscript. She was a very punctilious woman, if I can use that term, which is probably very fitting in the context, to go through and make sure she dotted all her I's and crossed all her T's, which you had to do if you were doing with a pen of that kind and ink. And she saw the I above, she saw the I below that she saw the I above and confused it with the I below and dotted that U in that one instance of the 100 where she actually made that mistake. So it was the one that she did was actually an explainable error, and and she did it, so it has to be explainable somehow why she dotted that other U. It's not so explainable because there's no undotted or dotted I above in the vicinity that she might have confused and thought she missed a dotting the way she did with the one out of 100 other I's that she did.
And that when you're saying the one out of a
Dotted
hundred
U.
U's that she put a dot above, you're saying that it seems like more of an anomaly, and there's a letter right above where she dotted an I, so that's a possible explanation. It's not like she's frequently dotting
Yeah.
a lot of her U's. And for me, just looking at it visually, like I feel like it's not very significant either way. I feel like it doesn't really undermine the evidence of the Mahaway Mahujah transliteration. But for me, looking at it, like it does kind of look like an I to me.
Hmm. Hmm. It does kind of to me too. And I'll say it did to John Whitmer and Edward Partridge. We're very familiar with them as orthography. They transcribed a lot of her stuff. So when they transcribed their versions of Moses 1, they both read it as Mahijah.
Yeah.
So they didn't neither one of them question that that was a U.
But
Um,
as we said before, even if Colby were correct, if it's a U, like it's one of those where to me it looks a bit more like an I than a U, but I feel like it wouldn't significantly undermine the argument for the Mahway Mahujah connection.
no, it does again, uh, in a sense, strengthen the connection with Book of Giants for me,
Yeah,
and strengthen, on the other hand, Colby's argument for a connection with Mehujael in the Bible on his part. So that's the real substance of why the argument could be important to someone.
sure. Yeah, I
But
don't know if
minor,
I'm
minor.
fully convinced that's a U, you know, to be honest.
Yeah. And again, I'll just summarize about the dotted U. We have an explicable dotted U in the one instance that we are sure that it was a dotted U, and we have an inexplicable dotted U if that was an error in this case. There's no good explanation for it that I can come up with why she would
Yeah,
have done
yeah.
that.
Okay,
Okay.
no, makes sense. I
So
tend to
start
agree.
with the easy ones. This was the easy one and it was still convoluted. So we're going to have some good conversations about the
Yeah, I
harder
feel
ones.
for listeners who, if this is new to them, because at least I've read the article, so I'm somewhat familiar with it. And you kind of need to look at the visuals to fully get probably what we're saying.
Yeah, thank heavens. Yeah, don't listen to this on your by audio only. I'm sorry for that.
You'll be
So
lost.
here's a table from a Bible commentary by Adam-Clarke, written in 1825. As I mentioned earlier, he was a near contemporary of Joseph Smith, or he overlapped with Joseph Smith. I don't know his birth and death date, but his commentary is 1825. And interestingly enough, I haven't seen this in any other Bible commentary. So this was a new discovery, and I give Colby credit for even finding this. I think he was perusing the Clark commentary and found it. It was a big deal about that time because um, who was it? Thomas Wayment and one of his students had had uh, had just been studying the possibility that Joseph Smith was using his um, the Clark commentary as the basis for some, or as to inform, let's just say, some of his translations. Anyway, Colby looked at that and he noticed something that doesn't appear in our English versions, that in the underlying Hebrew of the Old Testament, you have Mehujael and Mahijah in underneath. And in the English translations, it's always transcribed as Mehujael in English. So this was news to me, and I credit Colby for having discovered it.
Mhm.
So, uh,
So
oh, wait,
in the underlying Hebrew, we have two variants of the same name, Mehujael and Mahijael. Getting back to the root, it would be MHWY versus MHYY, but it's actually referring to the same individual, but that wouldn't have been known from the English text of the Bible. But he's saying that this showed up in Adam-Clarke's commentary, which I don't know if you've looked at Ken Jackson's rebuttals to the Adam-Clarke commentary
yeah,
connection.
yeah,
I'm very tentative when it comes to it. Like whenever the scholarship first came out from Thomas Wayment, I thought it seemed very much like cut and dry. Okay, he clearly was influenced and borrowed from Adam-Clarke's commentary. And then when I read through Ken Jackson's response to the interview with him, at least a lot more tentative when it comes to Adam-Clarke's commentary. And it was really long as well. And part of me finds it like a little bit hard to believe. Like, of course, if you're looking for a naturalistic source, that Joseph came across this table and that's what inspired him to include the two variants, for Mahijah and Mahujah. And doesn't this also sort of go against his previous argument that it's actually the same name, but he's saying that, oh no, this is where he came across two variants of
this
the
was
same name?
this was an alternative. This was an alternative. So he said, even if
Alternative explanation.
Elijah didn't make an error, then here's another way we could explain and strengthen the connection to Mehujael in Genesis 4:18.
Right. But your thoughts on Joseph Smith having access and likely coming across this?
I lean as you do towards Kent Jackson's, although with no disrespect to Tom Wayment and his students' scholarship on that. I'll say more about that in the next slide, but I'm yeah, I'll say more about that then. But to Colby, this at least provided a backup hypothesis to how, if it wasn't really two variants of the name in the original manuscript, and due to an error by Emma. Here's a way it could be two variants, and it still could come from Genesis 4:18. This provided a good naturalistic
This is how
explanation.
Joseph could have gotten the idea for including two different variations of the names. Now, I think my one point I'd say on this is if Joseph included the name Mehujael and Mehijael like this, I think that would be like, okay, maybe a stronger argument for this is where the source came, but Joseph at least changed the E to an A for Mahujah, and he also dropped the L suffix and replaced it with an H. So if he did come across this, which I don't find probable that he did, but let's just say he did come across this table, and that was the influence and the idea for the two different variants of the name. He then had to think, I'm going to change the E to an A, and I'm going to drop the L suffix and then add an H. Unknown to him that would be a stronger transliteration of Mahway from the Book of Giants than had he have just kept it the way it is. Like that's interesting if he did that.
It is not a slam dunk. And as I'm going to make a point in the next, as you're saying, it's not a slam dunk. And even then you have to say, why would Joseph Smith care about it that much to do that?
Yeah, that's very well thought out. Because if he did come across that, you would think he would, copy it. But he specifically, where I'm going to drop the L in both, but I'm going to have an I and a U because of what it says in this table of Adam-Clarke. Like that's a lot for him to have thought about. Like that's very careful.
So let's look at some points that build on the good one you made. Wayment himself and Haley Wilson Lemon, his student, claimed that Joseph Smith could have used Clarke as a translation aid, as we talked about. Kent Jackson is skeptical, and I'm somewhat skeptical as well.
Yeah, I'm a
But
bit too.
Wayment and Wilson Lemon argue, quote, that there are no parallels to Clarke between Genesis 1 and Genesis 24.
Hmm.
So at least it seems like if he did take from Clarke, it would be an exception, according to Wayment and Wilson Lemon, who studied the Clarke issue, to have taken anything before Genesis 24 from that thing. They found no instances.
Right.
Point two, and I'll read this just verbatim because it says it better and I can ad lib. Is it reasonable that Joseph Smith would actually have had the time, patience, and most importantly, a compelling reason to search through Clarke's commentary for two variant names he could use for an obscure twice mentioned character in his Genesis translation, presumably in order to give it more credibility? So think about from his perspective, that the only motivation I could think of him doing it. Remember that he had no hesitation providing previously publishing scores of strange-looking names in the Book of Mormon for which there was no biblical precedent.
Yeah,
So,
and not just like copying Mehujael and Mahijah, but like changing the E to an A and dropping the L in both. Like, so it's not even just a straight copy of that table with the two different variants. He would have to have been like, right, I'm going to use that as my inspiration, and I'm going to modify the name quite a bit.
and going further with what you're saying on the fourth bullet there, look at the picture now on the left. In the space of a few lines, he's got all kinds of variant spellings on Mehujael and Mahajah, Methusael and Methusael, Lamech, Lemah and Lamech. So the scribes are just writing down quickly what they're hearing. They're not being at all meticulous in these minor variations in verses that are just a short distance away from the one that Joseph Smith uh, contained, the two that Colby has been um, talking about.
No, quick question on that, because I
Yeah.
think maybe a stronger argument that I would make if I were in Colby's position is I would say, well, what if with the Mahijah Mahujah, two different variants, what if it was just either the scribe mishearing or miswriting the wrong letter? What if someone were to say that maybe Joseph said the same name twice, either Mahijah or Mahujah, but in one instance the scribe just miswrote it? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's just we have no tangible evidence for it, but it wouldn't be it would be just as plausible, except for the fact that we don't have any tangible evidence we do have in the handwriting. But you're absolutely right in my view.
Yeah. that in my mind would make more sense than the previous argument about the U is actually meant to be an or the I is meant to be a U.
And again, just reinforcing what's here in the picture is we have all kinds of variants, just random variants through these verses of spelling of names as the scribe was scribbling through, trying to get it all down. Um, and they really weren't trying to conform to any existing manuscript so much as taking dictation. They were not, at least at this point, they don't seem to be referring to the manuscript of the Bible even to get the spelling right, let alone
Right.
pouring through at Clarke's commentary.
Yes. So what would you say if someone were to push on Mahujah and Mahijah that we see in the Book of Moses? Oh, this isn't actually two variants coming from an ancient tradition preserving these two ancient names, but what if they were to say that this is either the scribes mishearing or just writing the name differently both times, similar to the examples you've shown here? And what if they say that's a better explanation for why we see two different variants of the same name?
I'd say you're right. If they said that, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Okay. So much for Adam-Clarke. I think we've kind of talked about that. Now, what about the different roots? And here's what Colby says about that they were actually different roots primarily because you have the hey versus the hate as the H-like letter that is in presumably the Book of Giants and the Book of Moses. And I say, yeah, he's mistaken about that, but let's just go with his thing right now because he's claiming that there's different letters that you've got an H in one and a hate in the other. Um,
So do two
and
different types of H's.
two different kinds of H's like you have
Okay.
in Hebrew or Aramaic.
Okay.
And then he argues, secondly, that there's a similarity in that root to two other names of the Book of Giants, Ohaya and Oya. And he argued that all three names were deliberate wordplay on the tetragrammaton. In other words, Yod-He, Vav-He, Jehovah, the four-letter name of the Lord.
Hmm.
So he's saying, hey, it kind of fits here too because it's and the reason why they put this crazy name Mahaway in here was just for wordplay. Just according to him, that's not my argument. And so he says that mix up between the Book of the Giants and the Book of Moses name occurred. But why Nibley thought that both of them had a regular H instead of a guttural H in the Book of Joseph was because, quote, Nibley relied too heavily on his English transcription of both names and failed to recognize the H in English represents two distinct letters in the ancient world. So that's kind of saying that Nibley was either very careless or he couldn't tell an hey from a hate. So,
Okay. So
um,
this one's a little bit more tactical and complex, but so basically, if I were to put it in simple terms, he's saying the H that we get from Mahway in the Book of Giants and the H in Mahujah that we get in the Book of Moses, he's saying those two H's from Aramaic and Hebrew basically are not identical or not the same or slightly different sounds, and that Nibley was relying on the English transliteration, seeing them as like directly the same, but he's saying that they would be different but from Hebrew to Aramaic. Is that correct?
right.
Okay.
Moreover, he was arguing, and you'll see the point of this a little bit later, that there was wordplay involving all three names um, in the Book of Giants, Haya, Oya, and Mahaway. We'll see in a minute why that's
Okay.
something worth questioning as well.
Okay.
Okay, so let's look at the counter argument. And by the way, the at left, that little, I didn't mention what that red circled square is. That was actually just demonstrating how transcriptions are hard to read. For a long time, the scholars didn't recognize this as one of the instances of Mahaway in the Book of Giants. It wasn't until decades later, I don't remember the exact year, that a great reader of ancient Hebrew named a French one named I don't know how you pronounce it in French actually because I've never heard it pronounced, but it's Puech, Push, transliterated that and discovered it was to Mahaway. So it's an instance of where expert scholars themselves had a hard time discerning what exactly was going on with the letters in that ancient stuff. So it's not surprising that what might seem a hey was really a hate and vice versa. And I have in the paper a lot of instances of that, as well as the argument that that within the Dead Sea Scroll community, this isn't just me, but it's other scholars who studied the pronunciation of those words, they actually tended to say them with a more guttural flavor. In other words, the hey more like a hate in the Qumran community, making it more likely that those two letters could be confused, both from pronunciation and from orthography. Maybe you want to restate that a little simpler. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, this is probably the part where I don't know if it's fully connecting my mind. So I'm reading through your first bullet point. It says we argue that because all we have is an English translation of Mahijah and Mahujah. This is referring to the Book of Moses. There is
Mhm.
no evidence that that were spelt
Yeah, they were spelled.
that they were
Yeah.
spelled anciently with an H with a dot underneath instead of an H. Could you maybe just re-explain that to me? Because I feel like it's not fully connected in my
Okay.
mind. This is probably because I'm not a linguistic expert.
Oh, no problem. Okay, this is a first point, a little bit different than the point I was just making a little bit previously. But
So
it's
he
basically
basically saying the Mahujah that we have in the Book of Moses or the name Mehujael, the H is different in the Hebrew to the H we get in the Aramaic. So that's the point he's made. So clarify for me
let me
what your response
let
is.
me let me back up. I wouldn't say it quite that way.
Okay.
He's saying that the Mahijah and Mahujah um, names in the Book of Moses, and see, I have to say it slowly or I'm going to get confused here too, are definitely have the hate with the H with the dot under it,
Okay.
whereas the ones in the Book of Giants definitely don't have it. Now we know, and we have a good conjecture that the ones in the Book of Moses, Book of Giants, at least at the time it was written, didn't have that thing, but we have no evidence for what kind of an H was behind Mahijah and Mahujah. All we have is the English transliteration. So he can't claim, as he does, that there's a different H in Mahijah and Mahujah than there is in the Book of Giants, because all we have is the
Oh,
English
I
version.
see. Right.
Does
So
that
it
make sense?
could be the same type of H as it is in the Book of Giants. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Okay. Now it makes sense.
So it's just I think a little fault in logic that he's made there because he's anxious to show the connection to Mehujael, that he's done that. But really, you're assuming that it's related to Mehujael, but we don't know that. We only have these English things, so it could just as well be related to the H in Mahaway because all we have is the English.
Okay. Would this be a good time to bring up the question I sent you from my friend, a listener, on
Sure,
this? Um,
sure.
so he brings up Mahaway is he says corrupt form. I guess he would say later form of Mahujah that we have in the Book of Moses. So he says it represents a later version that's been changed and altered. Because I guess he's saying the Book of Giants isn't the original Enoch text; it's sort of been modified. So he's saying Mahaway is sort of the altered form of the original version uh, of Joseph's Enoch that better from the original version of the story that Joseph's Enoch better represents. So he's saying that means that Mahijah or Mahujah is the more accurate name that was altered to become Mahway in the Book of Giants.
Yeah. So we have no, well, so um, if you take Mahijah and Mahujah, the characters as being living, being contemporaneous to Enoch, and then we don't know what was the real spelling of their names in that time. All we have is two manuscripts. Let me just take it step by step, right?
Right.
So the manuscript of the Book of Giants, the Qumran one we have, which is arguably the oldest one, dates to about 300 BC. The oldest one we have for the Book of Moses dates to 1830, and it's only in English. So we have no way to make a correspondence of what is more ancient, just referring to Book of Moses because it's derivative, English translation, and Book of Giants because itself it probably likely goes back to more ancient Mesopotamian originals. And as I make in point two, there's evidence of fluidity in both the sound of orthography of het and hey in relevant contexts. In other words, there are cases that there's some argument that the oldest form of Mahaway has a guttural H from Akkadian, and then it got softened in here. And then there's actually um, evidence in the time of Qumran that the pronunciation of the hey and het became more guttural, like a het, among the Qumran people. So it's very confusing and very difficult to come to any certain conclusion, like our friend, about what came first, the hey or the hate. Milik, I'll just say one other thing, and I know it's complicated. I'm losing probably everybody. I'll just say another argument that Milik, the translator of the Aramaic Book of Giants, said is he says that in his opinion, Mahaway was the earlier form and then later got changed to Mehujael in the Hebrew of the Bible. So he takes the Mahaway as being the earlier. So you have
Right.
opinion
The
on
more
all
ancient
sides.
version.
And there are very subtle differences sometimes, and it's hard to read sometimes, and different dialects pronounce things differently. So whether we'll ever get to the bottom of it, I don't know, especially because all we have is the H in English on the Book of Moses side. So who
Right.
knows where that was drawn from,
Yeah.
if you believe
Okay.
it's Semitic. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yeah, I think that does make sense. This is probably the most complex and technical argument. And would you view this as Colby's maybe strongest argument? You've sort of given it like a sort of good response to it, but do you think that's the best argument he's given to push back on the Mahujah connection?
I'd say so, that and the wordplay I'm going to talk about in a minute too.
Okay.
So, um, oh boy, I've got all kinds of spelling here. Stukenbrook, and there shouldn't be an I in the last syllable there, as opposed to Colby and a few others that tentatively proposed in some cases that there was wordplay between Oya, Haya, and Mahaway, as I have it, transcribed as MHWY here. All three of them, Stukenbrook only sees word plays with the two Oya and Haya and basically says, we don't know what to do with Mahaway. He doesn't seem very convinced. He's the preeminent living scholar on the Book of Giants. He doesn't seem that convinced that Mahaway is connected to Oya and Haiwa. And later on, we'll see why that's important. But that's another important argument that Colby makes that is not really borne out by the latest research on that and by some research on the literary aspects of those characters. I've also made arguments why Oya and Haya are distinct from Mahaway.
Okay.
So from a just a linguistic point of view, we're saying the Oya and Haya, the way they may be involved in wordplay with the name of Jehovah, but Mahaway, it's far from certain. He kind of comes from a different place. And I will argue later that his name seems more likely from other evidence to be historically plausible, opposed to Oya and Haya, which seem to be purely literary characters.
Right, because that was another critique and argument my friend brought up in his video was he was pointing to the theophoric suffix as ja, and you're saying that the scholars think there probably was some influence with the names of Oya and Heya with the tetragrammaton, Yahweh, that name, but with the name Mahaway, that they think that maybe went back more ancient and didn't have that theophoric suffix added in.
Wow, it's so complicated. I would say it just a little bit different. I'd
Okay.
say, first of all, the scholars are divided on the tetragrammaton question.
Okay.
And I'd say Colby comes down, and many scholars do, on it being related to the word for life and to be, which is related to that root. And so um, we could say that at least Um, some scholars do see that Yah there, in which case, if you saw the Yah and Mahujah and Mahijah as being a Yah thing, that would point to an early thing. But I'm not convinced of that. So I am more of the mind that um, that the JAH on the end of the Book of Moses names, which that Yah standing for Yahweh or Jehovah, only came into play from the 10th century onward, was more of a scribal um, anomaly than it was in the original source that Joseph Smith was translating. Sorry, my wife's saying goodbye to me here. Okay,
Oh,
see
no
you soon.
problem.
So the way I explain the JAH is that uh, in my mind, it's plausible that the scribes, not being very familiar with all the Old Testament names that ended in JAH, and not being aware of that those didn't come into vogue till the 10th century, just added an H on the end because that seemed like a better spelling than than just leaving an A on the end. Whereas the A on the end would have been much more plausible um, uh, if you were going to put a vowel on the end at all, as opposed to leaving a J on the end. Sorry, why don't you try
Okay.
and paraphrase?
Okay, right. I think I'm understanding. Let me just read you his question. Um,
Okay.
I'll just read this to you because I think I'm understanding what you're saying. But obviously, when it gets into linguistics and all that, I feel like
Sure.
this is water. This is a bit beyond me. So this is his critique. He says an issue with Mahujah is the ja ending of the name. So Mahijah Mahujah. He says nowhere in the patriarchal literature, so I think he's saying like prior to like the 10th century BC,
Mhm.
does a ja ending for a name appear. This is likely because those textual layers were produced when El Elyon was still the Canaanite high deity before Yahweh had taken that place. However, even if that's not the explanation you'd accept, the fact is that the ja endings, which are Yahwistic theophoric elements, do not appear anywhere in the patriarchal literature, certainly not in the primeval history. The name Mahijah or Mahujah appears to be out of place. So he's basically saying that the Ja theophoric suffix in the name Mahijah Mahujah almost seems to be like anachronistic or out of place because we don't see those theophoric suffixes showing up until after the 10th century BC, that really it should be more L prior to that. And he's saying that prior to the 10th century BC, he would have been seen, El Elyon as like the high Canaanite deity. So El was put on as the suffix on the end of the names. Could you just restate simply what is your response to that?
So in this case, I will side fully with my opinion in favor of what your friend is saying, both in terms of the dating of the ya suffix, and the fact that if it were intended, if we knew that Joseph Smith was intending to put a ya suffix in terms of its spelling, that we were being meticulous and spelling it out like he did many Book of Mormon names with a JAH, then that would be strong evidence against the authenticity of these names in the Book of Moses. My view is, based on what we've seen of the way the scribes worked, is just basically writing down what they heard in this part of the Book of Moses. They were not referring to the Bible a lot as they were in other parts of the Joseph Smith translation because he was dictating a bunch of new stuff, right? So they were scribbling it down as he was dictating it orally, and there's no evidence that he was spelling out the names as he did apparently in the Book of Moses. My view is that the H was added by the scribes um, anachronistically, if taking the argument of your friend, which I agree with, it's not authentic, the H on the end.
When
It's
you say
only
the
there.
scribes, you mean the Joseph Smith scribes when he's
Joseph
dictating the
Smith
Book of
scribe.
Moses?
Yeah, Joseph Smith scribes added it because it was natural for them to say, well, it's like an Old Testament name. And so if it doesn't have an L on the end, like Mehujael, it must end in an H like Elijah or Jehovah um, or Jeremiah or all the
Okay.
others that
Yeah.
I hate. So this is your friend is right, I would say, about the evidence. But I ascribe, and this is just my conjecture, that but backed by the way that the scribes, I think, can be shown to have worked, that the H was a scribal error rather than an error, a material error introduced by Joseph Smith coming out and saying this name is spelled Mahijah, and him rather just saying Mahijah, and the scribes figuring out how it was spelled. As we saw in this slide, where the spelling was all over the place, right?
Hmm. Okay. I have one last quick question on this because I'm just trying to wrap my head around all
Yeah,
this.
yeah, please.
So when he's saying that Joseph Smith is adding this theophoric suffix ja, and that's a problem because, and again, you're saying that the h might be added by the scribes, but Joseph is at least saying ja, and they're spelling it. And he's saying that the ja suffixes don't show up until after the 10th century BCE. But then when I look at Mahway, MHWY, when you
Mhm.
transliterate that, isn't Mahujah, it's not so much Joseph is adding this theophoric suffix on the end, but wouldn't Mahujah be like a correct transliteration of MHWY?
Um, no, the Y on the end indicates a Y or a J in English consonants.
Hmm.
And so in the paper, I won't get into it because I can't remember exactly. David Calabro, who's just a wonderful linguist, Latter-day Saint scholar, argues that, the original form could have even been something like Mahuj, right? And
Mahuj.
in which case that it ended with a J with just that Y. The A, remember that the A, the vowels were not in the Aramaic or the Hebrew. So we're conjecturing when we're looking at the ancient manuscript that is there. They didn't add the Mahaway, they didn't add any vowels to the end of it, choice, but some other scholars do. Um, um, but Joseph Smith chose to add it, and David Calabro, I'd look at his work, which I don't have time to look up right now to kind of get a feel for that. But remember that in the Bible we have Mehujael, don't we?
Hmm.
And so there we have an example of Mahujah without an H, without any idea that that was a Yahwistic ending. And then it's got an L ending. As your friend said, that would have been more common. Mahujah. Here we have it neither with an L, neither with a JAH. I think we have just the pure Mahujah. Does
Right.
that
So
make
if you
sense?
took away the L suffix from Mehujael, it would be Mahujah and it would be JA at the end. And you're saying either Mahuj or Mahujah without the H could be a correct transliteration of Mahway or
That's right.
MHWY.
And we don't know that there may not have been a vowel on the end when folks in Qumran pronounce it. Maybe there's arguments I don't know about, but it could have been, so far as we know, Mahaway or Mahuha or something, where it ends in the A, just as easily as it is Mahaway, just ending with a Y, because we don't have any vowels in the Aramaic or the Hebrew, right?
And
So
if
Mahujah.
Joseph Sorry, I'm asking
Mhm.
you a lot of questions because I'm just
Oh,
trying to make sense of this.
yeah.
If Joseph, I guess we don't know, but if when he did say Mahujah or Mahijah, if he did in his mind intend that the translation is JAH on the end as opposed to J or JA, would that be a problematic transliteration of Mahaway, or would that still be a plausible and valid transliteration of MHWY?
Yes, I would just say give Joseph the benefit of the doubt and say he's not infallible. So it's possible that he may not have done it, but my conjecture is that he didn't. We don't have no evidence that he spelled out the names. We have evidence that the scribes were working quickly and using their best sense to fill out names. But I would say, had Joseph Smith spelled it out with the JAH,
Mhm.
that would have been a good argument for your friend against it because we don't have JAH supplements at that time. We just have Mahijah with an L on the end, as he said, or else we have Mahijah or Mahuj or whatever with just a J, which is a yod on the end, one way or the other, but we don't have an AH on the end.
Okay.
So the
Okay.
answer is yes. It would be a good argument if Joseph Smith was intended that it ended in a theophoric ending of Jehovah, but since we have no evidence for that, the H on the end as a scribal error doesn't really count against Joseph Smith.
I see. And just restate this one last time. So if he did spell it out JAH, you're saying that that would be a strong counter argument from my friend here, saying almost like that would be anachronistic. And even if Joseph did say JAH, are you saying that still couldn't work as a plausible transliteration of MHWY? Or would it have to be J or JA?
So the Y and the name in the Qumran document, I'm going to have to say it a little differently,
Sure.
is generally transliterated as Mahaway.
Yeah.
From my understanding, could have just as soon been YA or JA on the end, but it would not have had an H.
I
And
see.
yes, so we don't know how it was pronounced exactly. We just have how it was written with four consonants. Same thing with the English version of Mahijah and Mahujah, but it probably did not have in ancient times if we believe it. And if we believe that the scribes were just adding it, that H was there because the scribes added it according to their own best sense of Old Testament names rather than Joseph Smith um, uh, saying that it must be there.
Okay, I see. I see. And do you think this is probably one of the strongest counter arguments someone's made against the name Mahujah? Because I feel like, okay, that actually seems like a fairly decent counter argument he's brought up.
Yeah, I think so. I think
Okay.
so. And I give your friend credit for making a good point there. And
Well done,
and
Tyler.
obviously it's yeah. And there our evidence against that is only our reconstruction of the scribal method for this. And that's all we have to go by.
And
Um,
last very quick question on this, because I know Royal Scousand says there's some evidence in the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon of Joseph spelling out names. For example, they would
mhm.
write a name phonetically and then they would cross it out, and then, they would write it the way Joseph was spelling it out. Do we have any evidence in the Book of Moses transcripts of Joseph spelling out names, or is he just saying them and they're just, writing them down as they hear it?
No, to me, the evidence we have is to the contrary, just as we show in this graphic here, that the scribes were writing at least the portions of the Book of Moses, Book of Moses that were not taken mostly from the Genesis translation of the Bible, or are not closely affiliated to it. The new material was coming out quickly, and as Joseph spoke it, it seems from the scribal evidence we see here, and the scribes are writing it down somewhat willy-nilly as fast as they could without paying too much attention to the spelling and doing the best they could. That's what the
Gotcha.
examples in that same verse seem to
That's
tell.
what the
So that's the
manuscript evidence supports. Okay.
support.
Thank you for clarifying all of that for me.
Yeah. So this is as hard as it gets. I hope the listeners haven't given up on us for this because after this, it's
Yeah.
more fun and
This is
entertaining.
if we referred into the gospel and the church as the meat, this is some of the heaviest and chewiest meat you're gonna come across. This is quite technical.
Now we're going to get into some, I think, well, I'm going to do a little summary here, and then we're going to get into some positive stuff, if that's okay. Do we have time to continue maybe 20 minutes
Oh
longer?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, we don't want to leave the ending off. So here's something just looking to maybe this will be a different way of answering the kinds of issues that you were just bringing up. If we look at just the surface manifestation of the names, Mahujah, Mahijah, to the Book of Giants in Genesis 4:18 along a number of criteria, here's what we find. And the plus means it's similar, and the minus means it's dissimilar. Okay. So, for example, we have a plausible match between the Book of Moses to either H or H with the dot under it, namely Chet in Hebrew. And that's true with the Book of Giants and with the Bible because uh, either one could have been transliterated that way. It could have been that way in its original form, according to the scholarship that I've looked at. Are you with me? So that gets a plus. It's similar to both. The plausible English vowel match after the M. We find, by the way, the scribes of Joseph Smith sometimes writing ME and MA for similar names within that verse 418. But that isn't the one that matters because we have no evidence either way. But we find it written both ways. We have Mehujael with an M-E, and we have Mahaway with an M-A in the Book of Giants scholarship world. We're
Right.
just conjecturing somewhat about those vowels. Okay, so matches both. Plausible vowel match after the H in the Maha part, same thing. It could be either an E or an A. There's no L termination. Here's where a difference is. There's no L termination in the Book of Moses or the Book of Giants, but we do have the L in Genesis 4:18. So
Right.
there's a difference. And then we have for the termination, plausible match of the name form termination. Um, I can't remember right now what I'm talking about there.
I don't
Okay,
know
well,
either.
you'll have to forgive me on that. At any rate, the plausible match of the English H termination, you have to refer to the paper if you want. That's true that the H appears in neither one, but we have an alternate explanation as a scribal error with some evidence of how the scribes worked to explain that H or terminal JAH. But it's really not the JA that we have to explain. It's really just the H we have to explain because that turns it into a theophoric Jehovah name. See what I'm saying? The JA is plausible,
Yeah, it's not the
equally
problem.
plausible to just the J. Yeah,
Okay. And to put on sort of the naturalistic hat for a moment, I think like my friend's theory, and it sounds like Colby's is somewhat similar, that obviously there's a similarity between Mahijah, Mahujah, and Mehujael from the Old Testament. And my friend's theory, whenever I watched his video, is that Joseph is sort of taking that name but replacing the L suffix with the ja suffix. And let's just say, okay, that's what Joseph was doing. Why would Joseph do something like that? Like, why would he think to replace L with Ja if you're going for a naturalistic theory? That's one thing that I can't quite understand, unless he's just being creative and making changes to the name. But I would just wonder why he would make a change like that from L to Ja. Do you have any thoughts?
I don't see any motivation. I'm presuming that you know, he's translated just trace translated Mehujael. Why wouldn't he have just taken that name if it there's nothing that's going to count for or against the plausibility of his having an authentic manuscript to use a Mahujah rather than Mehujael. So I guess the best you could just argue is that it was careless, but the thought of it being deliberative that he did it, I don't see any motivation for him doing it deliberatively rather than just randomly if you're thinking about it from a naturalistic perspective. If you're thinking about it from a uh, authenticity perspective, the Mahujah is definitely, as long as you discount the H as a scribal error, is definitely more plausible in this instance.
As a correspondence to the name Mahaway had rather than if he had just copied the name Mehujael and had the two different variants, that wouldn't be as strong a correspondence to Mahway in the Book of Giants.
That's right. You said it better than I could.
Okay.
If I can sum up, do you have anything else? And then I was going to sum up the lesson of this table.
No, you sum it up.
Okay, summing up the lesson of this table is actually the Mehujael and the Book of Giants stuff and the Book of Moses are all pretty similar to each other. The only one that really stands out too much are the H thing, which we think is a scribal anomaly, and the L termination, but pretty much the L says so. The next question is, might the names from the Book of Giants, the Bible, and the Book of Moses all trace back to Mesopotamia? Okay, well, let's just see what scholars think about this. Now, this is a moot point for anybody who thinks of the purely naturalistic thing that Joseph Smith was just copying from the Bible or being creative or whatever. But this is important for anybody who's interested in biblical scholarship, who's interested in where the story of Enoch came from, for anybody who's interested in where the Book of Giants came from, who might have just a spark of interest to say, could the Book of Enoch have come from somewhere else than just a purely West Semitic source? Could it be, more ancient than that? Have some threads from more ancient times. Okay, you with me?
Hmm.
So let's see what some modern scholars say about threads in Mesopotamia in these areas. So those who've looked at names, Nahum Sara, Richard Hess, following Umberto Cassuto, see multiple names in Genesis 4 as having plausible Mesopotamian roots. There's one argument. They suggest that the name Mehujael might be explained on the basis of Akkadian Mahu, denoting a certain class of priests and seers. And what was the role of those seers? Among other things, the royal archives of the old Babylonian kingdom of Mari recount the comings and goings of Mahu as intermediaries and messengers, bearing words of warning from the gods for a king, a role that can be favorably compared to that of Mahaway in the Book of Giants. So, thinking that sometimes in the Bible, names reflect roles and personality as much as, particular names that we have, similar to, say, what we have in Native American tribes and other kinds of cultures around the world. It's certainly interesting to conjecture that somebody who was a messenger, a Mahu, that was a functional name, might have had that name as their personal name as they moved into that role, which would have been a very nice fit to the role and the only role that Mahaway really plays in the Book of Giants. He's in the book of Moses, he's asking questions, and it's a similar role that he's playing in the Book of Giants, and
Right.
that's it.
Intermediary who goes to Enoch. Doesn't he go to Enoch to get interpretations of the dreams that they're having?
That's right. That's right. So a very and he's an intermediary with the kings. In this case, he's an intermediary with his friends Oha and Haya and the other elders of the Gibberim tribe. And the other, he's presumably we have very little less information Book of Moses, but what is he doing? He asks through a couple questions, I guess it is, and then he's gone.
Hmm.
So isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So Mahu. So what else about Mesopotamia? Well, notice that Mehujael's grandson, Lamech, which Cassuto seems likely to come from the Mesopotamian word Lumaku, also signifies a certain class of priests. Again, a role name that becomes, in the Bible, a personal name. And it really doesn't come, according to Hess, anywhere from in Western Semitic, that is Israelite, more recent kind of things, but it's third millennium BCE personal names and names from Mari and Old Babylon in second millennium. So the time frame is much better suited to a Mahaway to a third millennium BCE or a second millennium BCE name than it would be for something later that was dreamed up. Okay,
Okay.
that's according to these Hebrew scholars on names in the Bible.
Hmm.
Now, so in terms of Book of Giants and scholars, they continue to accumulate evidence of strands of Mesopotamian influences in the Book of Giants. There's more written on this, but the one I'll mention is that all the names in the Book of Giants, of all those names, the names of Enoch and Mahway appear to have the greatest weight of having real, historically plausible characters behind them. Now, I'm just um, not going into the detailed arguments here. I've written more about them elsewhere. But in the next slide, I'm going to show a table to show how those two names appear across a wide variety of literary and historical contexts. So let's take Oya and Haya. They appear only in the Book of Giants and nowhere else. And they have a particular function, as I'm going to argue a little bit later. They are, to put it mildly, and which I argue in more detail in the paper, they're literary characters. They add a little bit of humor to the story, as it were. They're comical characters. They're big, clumsy oafs who get scared. The type of a big, strong man who gets runs away when a mouse comes or an elephant, right? They're that kind of a character, and they have these fantastic dreams. So they seem to be there for literary entertainment value. They don't appear anywhere else. So that's a strike against them, in my view, as I argue, for them being possibly historic characters. How about Shemi Chaza and Barakel? They are somewhat known in the apocalyptic literature in um, in ancient Jewish tradition, and they show up in First Enoch, which heavily draws on the literature. but they're nowhere in Mesopotamia, nowhere in Genesis, nowhere in Moses 6 and 7. Pretty good argument that they're not, in my view, historical, and that Joseph Smith didn't pick up on anything in First Enoch of those names when he was trying to bring them through. And good thing they didn't. If he would have picked up on Shemi Hassa and Barakel as names in Moses 6 and 7, those would have been some pretty good strikes against.
Be more
uh,
problematic and even
were more
anachronistic.
problematic.
Right.
But again, they seem like characters driven that were derived from elsewhere in Jewish tradition to kind of fill out the story of First Enoch, which I think is being somewhat more fanciful in nature than the Book of Giants anyway. Now there is some fancy in the Book of Giants, however.
Sure.
And part of that fancy is the names of Gilgamesh and Hobabish, which you probably, scholars believe, relates to Humbaba in the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, which is what kind of epic? It's a Mesopotamian epic. And so it seems as if Book of Giants have taken some well-known characters, probably, in my view, for literary reasons, from their Mesopotamian epics. They've thrown them in the middle of the Book of the Giants, and they're there and nowhere else in these other accounts that we're showing. That makes sense?
Yeah, I think it does, yeah.
Thank heavens Moses 6 and 7 didn't pick up either of those names either, did it? So that's pretty interesting since it did seem to draw on the Book of Giants, which some scholars think Joseph Smith must have had access to. But he didn't pick, he didn't pick those names. What did he pick? The only named character other than Enoch in the Book of Moses is Mahaway. And that was a good one to pick if you were a conscious imposter, Joseph Smith. Enoch was a good one because Enoch appears in First Enoch, in the Mesopotamian literature, arguably, if you think of him as being MHWY, which is quite a different tradition, but some scholars do see a connection to Enoch there. He's in Genesis and he's Moses 6 and 7. Sounds like of all these previous characters, he's the most likely to have a backstory that somewhere might have a plausible historical precedent, at least relatively speaking to these other guys up above him. What about Mahaway? He comes pretty close to, he does not show up in First Enoch, interestingly enough. But of course, Joseph Smith brought him into Moses 6 and 7. That's quite a dare on his part if he were simply making him up. But we have a Mesopotamian equivalent, Mahu, the name of a certain kind of priest in that literature. We have Mehujael in Genesis, and we have Moses 6 and 7 with that. So maybe just from naturalistic background, he doesn't have quite as strong story as he might have if he were showing up in First Enoch, if you take First Enoch too seriously. But that's a pretty good pedigree. If he were to pick any two of those characters, he picked the right one to put in Moses 6 and 7, in my view. Anything you'd like to say about that?
So just briefly, like the root of, the name Mahujah or Mahaway, you're saying that there's precedent that this could go back anciently in ancient Mesopotamian, traditions and texts. You were pointing to the Mahu part, going back anciently. So this seems like a very plausible ancient name. The Mahujah part not being something that dates after like the 10th century BC or at a time that would be more anachronistic.
That's right. So put it another way, and I think those of us who believe that Enoch was a real character and who believe that maybe he and think that there's something to the ancient, some history behind the ancient Gibborim and wild men that inhabited Mesopotamia, an ancient Mesopotamian setting for Enoch and Mahaway seems more plausible than just, an Israelite setting, just a priori, just prima facie, right? So Enoch and Mahaway are kind of showing up in the environment, just piecemeal, and of course, a lot of chaff with the wheat in the kind of place and in the kind of timing that we'd expect. Were there possibly some real history behind these stories? That another way to say it?
Yeah. Okay. That's good. That makes
Okay.
sense.
Okay, let's take that a little further. Could we, do you want to say anything about the names? And then I'd love to just close with saying a few other things about the Book of Giants and the Book of Moses beyond the names, just to remind the readers what kind of a case we're talking about.
Yeah, I probably have one last question specifically on the correspondence. Were you going to get into the overlap in the roles, or did we already
Uh,
touch on that between
uh,
Mahaway and Mahujah?
yeah, I was not going to get into it anymore. I think the basic idea that it's important people say, and the roles are important, is that Mahaway was in the Book of Mormon, or I'm sorry, the Book of Moses. These names are tripping me up.
Yeah,
So Mahijah and Mahujah in the Book of Moses, I'm sorry, Mahijah at least, is a character that asks questions of Enoch. And Mahujah, Mahaway in the Book of
Giants.
Giants also has that role. And thirdly, um, that was the role that was as a mediator and question answer or asker that seems to be behind the derivation of the title of priest king in Mesopotamian literature. So that role that Mahijah and Mahujah, Mahijah at least we can say in this context, plays in the Book of Moses corresponds quite well to the role that he plays in the Book of Giants. We don't have really very much about the role of Mehujael in Genesis, so we can't say much about that.
Okay, and if it was just the name correspondence that we would see between the Book of Giants and the Book of Moses, that would be one level of correlation, but you would see the similarities in the role of being this intermediary who goes to Enoch and asks questions. Is that sort of strengthening the name correspondence because it's not just name, but it's also some similarities in the role of both characters.
Absolutely. And that conclusion goes clear back to Nibley. He very wisely noted, he very wisely noticed that correspondence in both name and role.
Okay. So my last question when it comes to the Mahujah connection, we've gone into, the weeds and the technicalities. How would you rate the overall correspondence of Mahujah versus Mahaway? If we were to go sort of on a spectrum, some might say, is it a weak parallel? Is it a coincidence? Is this a plausible correspondence? Is it a very, very plausible? Or is this like a bullseye hit? I guess if you were to pick where you see the level of the correspondence between Mahujah and Mahway, where would you sort of rate it?
So I would rate it as something pretty close to a bullseye, especially if you're not hung up on the surface English transliteration of the names and you look at the how those names would have been written, presumably in Hebrew or Aramaic. It's a bullseye in terms of the name. And um, I think that unless you believe that the stories of Matthew Black uh, uh, were messed up by those who transmitted them to us, they immediately recognized them as bullseyes themselves. And if you go to Salvatore Cirillo, and again another non-Latter-day Saint scholar who was trying to find the strongest connection he could for the Book of Moses and the Book of Giants, he landed directly on this name, and he didn't have any quibble about it. So I'd say that's as close to a bullseye you could get on the name. When we add to that the information about the role, and when we add to the fact that it's a name and a role that doesn't just go back to the time of the Kingdom of Israel, but goes back to Mesopotamia, where arguably threads go back to the time that Enoch would have lived, then I think it becomes fantastically strong.
Okay. At least if someone maybe saw either some of the arguments from Colby or from my friend with regards to the theophoric suffix undermining it a little bit, I still see it, both the combination of the name and the role, very plausible in my mind. I find, okay, maybe it's not 100% undeniable proof. There's some, things people can bring up to challenge it a little bit, but I still think it seems very, very plausible. And both the combination of the name correspondence and the role, in my mind, I see it still as like very plausible. And while they brought up some critiques that might push back on it a little bit, I still think it seems very plausible.
Yeah, and I would say the strongest argument, just to be fair, I think is the one your friend Tyler, is it Tyler, brings
Tyler,
up.
yes.
Yeah, and I'll call him my friend too, because he's definitely interested uh, in establishing the truth of some of these things that are very important to those of
Yeah, and
us.
he's one of those listeners who he'll be following this episode very closely as well, which I really appreciate.
So if you didn't buy these other arguments that have been brought up, and if you didn't buy that, uh, and if you thought that the scribes and Joseph Smith worked some other way than the way I've described, then probably his argument about the JAH would be one of the strongest ones out there, and I'll state that explicitly. But I think the cumulative evidence, as well as a good scribal explanation for the H on the end, uh, makes more sense to me.
Okay. And actually, one last point, and this might be a good transition because you want to talk about other sort of thematic correspondence you see with the
Mhm.
Book of Enoch. But
Mhm.
what if someone were to say, like, why not just go with the theory that Joseph is sort of interacting with and modifying the name Mehujael? For some reason, he changed it from L to Ja. And if Joseph did envision, an H on the end, as you said, that would be Tyler's sort of strongest argument. That would be a
Mhm.
problem. But why not just say that this is just Joseph modifying a biblical name, and this is just a coincidental correlation that we're seeing between Mahujah and Mahaway in the Book of Giants, as opposed to trying to argue that it's somehow a transliteration of an ancient name. Why not just go with it's a coincidence, and you can explain it through a naturalistic theory that Joseph is just modifying the name Mehujael.
So I would respond that non-Mormon scholars who we have record of, Matthew Black and Salvatore Cirillo at least, didn't want to explain it as a coincidence, number one. But I would say that after all, the names are just a small part of the whole story. So if I were to be proven wrong on just the point of the name, uh, and I don't want to say proven wrong, we're all dealing with this the best
Or
we
if you were
can.
to drop from a near bullseye to like, okay, maybe plausible.
Yeah, then I would not destroy my feelings about the plausibility of the book of the story of Enoch and the Book of Moses being an ancient document, because there are so many other things that also bear on its ancient nature,
Right, that also need to
apart from
be
spiritual
taken into
things.
account and explained as well, not just this one alone. So you wouldn't say Mahujah. Well, this does seem to be the strongest correspondence, the name and the role. Even if you were to see this as like, okay, maybe it's not a direct proof. Maybe it's you were to drop a little bit if you felt like it was undermined or challenged a little bit. That still wouldn't explain all of the other parallels and correspondences you seen, both
Yeah,
specific and also thematic.
you said it well, and I guess that's just moving to sort of what I encourage our listeners to do, that if you have any doubts about that, or if you're a podcaster who's talking about the issue, I'd encourage you to make sure you go beyond that, the issue of the name, to the wider resemblances that we're going to be talking about, and some of the other interesting um, testimonies of the Book of Moses, and then obviously to give it some thought and prayers we are wont to do when we really want to get an answer from God on these things. But don't just focus on this issue and this issue alone. Look at all the evidence together carefully, and then after you've come up with the best, closest to the truth you can make it, then take it to God.
Love it.
Okay. Wow, that's been fun. But
Yeah.
let's have a little change in gears, and say what else are we talking about here? This is, by the way, Stukenbrook's book on the Book of Giants from Qumran. He's like I say, the probably the most respected living scholar on the Book of Giants from Qumran. A great man, and I've benefited a lot from his work. Um, here are here is a list, just for to have it all on one page, of correspondences from both the Qumran texts, the ones that start with 1Q, 4Q, etc., and the other Manichean texts, mostly that start with a name like Henning or Sunderman and others, to various aspects of the Book of Moses with specific verses and references, and they're ordered according to chronologically with respect to the Book of Moses, so you can take and deal with those. They're also ordered with respect to an outline of Stukenbrook's assembly of how he thinks the pieces in the Book of Moses were ordered in the original text. And you'll see there's some reasonable correspondence. We go A, B, B, and then there's a K in there that's anomalous, and then and then HIIOOS, and then an anomalous couple Ks, and then an N and a T. But it's not a terrible correspondence. He could be wrong about some of those, or maybe the Book of Giants did order them differently. But to me, it's a pretty reasonable correspondence, and even for some of those ordering anomalies, we might call them, the stray Ks and the stray what is the other one in there? That stray N. I discuss those in the text and state why I think that the Book of Mormon, which is my gold standard, may be right about those. So there's something to look at. Now let's just see the resemblances between the Book of Moses and the Book of Giants and other Enoch texts. I don't know if we went over these slides when we talked of things before. Do you remember?
Yes, I think
Stephen?
we did. I do remember these slides.
Okay, I hope that this would be useful. There's just 3 or 4 of them. I think it'd be worth a review. So when we look at the Book of Giants, compare the Book of Moses and compare to other Enoch texts, again, it's that we're trying to get some overview so we aren't overwhelmed by the details, and you can get the details in other stuff that myself and others have written. And the events are again ordered the way they are in the Book of Moses. And X indicates that there's some correspondence, large or small, somewhere to that particular theme. These are thematic resemblances, let's just say, and that there exists a theme in there to the Book of Moses. Okay, then let's just kind of carve this up a little bit. When we look at the stories that are in gray, we can say that's the historic backbone of the stories. If you just had those gray stories, the Gibborim and the prophets and the others are begotten, there's violence, there's oaths, you have Mahijah and Mahaway come along, repentance, and then the end, the people ascend to heaven. That's the backbone of the story of all those gray areas of the Book of Moses. And you see they're in gray. Then we can kind of move to the blue ones, which are also in the Book of Moses, but they are what I would call sacred stories. And they, for example, the Call of Enoch is something that has, some apocalyptic areas. It has some revelations and visions. You have some messianic teachings, which may have been among some of the things that were secret and hidden. Enoch's vision of the glories, which, in the later Enoch texts are considered to be, again, apocalyptic texts, his vision. So I'd say those are, say, more spiritual and more esoteric stories as opposed to historic. And then you have the red ones, which are mainly were the ones in which Oya and Haya appear, which are to me just kind of literary relief for those who may have compiled and redacted this story. They're a little bit of comic relief. The antics of the twins, Oya and Haya, they're in red here. Notice something interesting. They appear only in the Book of Giants. That kind of goes along with the slide we showed earlier to show they kind of seem to be literary characters that started out as being quite unique to the Book of Giants, not necessarily as much evidence that they have any kind of a backstory before that. We don't have any evidence for that, like we do for some of the others. Now let's look again at the Book of Giants and notice that they are all gray and red, the column that contains Book of Giants. In other words, they're either historic backbone or what I consider to be, and this is my own analysis, and I won't say it's 100% right, but I've given it a lot of thought, or they were literary color, let's just say, the antics of the twins and their dreams. So in a sense, Book of Giants seems to have been redacted by, let's just say, a little more secular audience for entertainment value. Some of the traditions handed down, the stories and the comic relief kinds of things. And what's left out are the sacred stories that either may have been added later or put out, as we've seen in some of the Jewish literature, where there are versions of the stories that are in there for certain ones of the initiated and taken out for other readers. And that's a very interesting way to think about, to my mind, what the Book of Giants is and what it is in comparison to the other uh, Enoch works. Notice, however, interestingly about the Book of Moses is it has does everything apart from the antics and dreams of the twins, everything but the comic relief. It's got the sacred stories and it's got the historic backbone. And that to me is thrilling because it's got stuff that no other one source really has in as much completeness, let's just say. Let me just stop there for a minute. Do you have any comment or things you'd like to say about that, Stephen?
I'll just say briefly that there's correspondences that you're showing between some of the storyline and the narrative between the Book of Moses and the Book of Giants, but some of the specific, very spiritual aspects, sacred parts, you're saying those are sort of not present in the Book of Giants. But here on the table, you're saying that there's some of those things can be found in some of the other Enochic pseudepigrapha, like second or third Enoch or the Mandean Enoch, for example. So it seems that this is a more, how would you put it, maybe Lord of the Rings sort of version of Enoch, with the Book of Giants.
Yeah, good way of putting it. Okay, that's as much as I'm going to say about that, but I just wanted to put that home so you could see that comparison. I've got other charts in the books and so forth you may want to look at that does that comparison and says why the Book of Giants is special in that way. But this is much I want to say about here. I'd like to say a few words. Do you think we have time to just go through a couple of
Sure,
the
yeah.
fun paintings, the Manichean cosmology painting?
Hmm.
Okay, this is really cool because it's fairly recent. I didn't have it in hand when I wrote In God's Image and Likeness too, but I did when I wrote the Enoch book. And it was just a thrill to say, not only do we have Enoch and Mahway there, but arguably both characters in living color, which was just a thrill, as well as some of the other events that are in the Book of Moses that aren't anywhere else. So just briefly, it's a wall hanging. That's one of the 9 recently discovered Chinese Manichean paintings preserved in Japan. Just a reminder, the Manicheans were a religious sect that came from the Middle East, preserved some of the older Jewish transitions via Asian and Middle East traditions. This particular visual depiction dates to the 14th or 15th centuries, although it may have older roots. Um, and in one part of it, it's got a whole bunch of Book of Giant visual motifs, essentially large parts of the history. And it's mostly in one place in a section called the 8 layers of the earth. For the sake of time, I'll jump right to that. So here's a picture of the 8 layers of the earth where we find the Book of Giant story. And I think it was placed here because this is kind of the center. If you think about the painting as being analogous to the human body. Obviously, there's an allegory with the human body going on here with some Manichean things about it. This was the center. This is the body of the human that's there. It's really the navel, if you want to say, and that tree, which is corresponds to Mount Sumeru at the top of a mountain, the sacred mountain in India, is the most sacred place. And at the top of it, we'll say more about that in a minute, are the gods and those who dwell near the gods. Okay.
Hmm. Yep.
And then as you move out from that sacred center, the way this kind of pictographic method works, you get to less sacred parts. So the wicked world and all its denizens are out there further away from that sacred center. Here is Enoch in living color. It's probably not any more authentic than the Enoch painting we saw at the beginning, but at least it's closer to the to the time frame by quite a few years, and we don't know how much further back the iconography goes than the 14th or 15th century. It may be a copy of something earlier. But you can see a distinctly Chinese or Japanese look to Enoch, which is fun. And then if you look really carefully, you can see, and this is just not the best resolution
Looks
I
like
could
there's
get.
someone beside him.
Yeah, there's somebody beside him. It's one of 4 angels that are surrounding him and protecting him at the base of the sacred center of the tree. He
Hmm.
is definitely seen as the most sacred of characters in this story. Okay, and we'll just say that an interesting story that's represented in this Mural is Enoch's call to repentance. In the text, we get the fact that there are, that Enoch spoke forth the words of God, and the people trembled and could not stand in his presence. In the Book of Moses, Book of Giants, we see that they not only trembled, but they prostrated and wept before him. They bowed down and wept. Those that were tyrants and criminals, the unrepentant faction, were worried and much afraid. So there's kind of the basic story. But some of them were exhorted to, and some, according to Book of Giants, actually did repent, became repentant. The best idea that Book of Giants scholars have is that these two characters, kneeling almost as far out in the periphery as you can have them, were two characters that corresponded to Oya and Haya, kneeling and being afraid in their dark cloud of uncertainty of what Enoch has told them will happen to them if they don't repent. So that's just fun.
That's cool.
And then we can just quickly sample a few other things. Mahaway, his first earthly journey, he comes out of nowhere and asks a question and so forth. We learn from the Book of Moses. And then there's the Book of Giants, where he is in his first, I don't remember if actually the one at the far right there, the column is from his first or second journey. We have two separate journeys of Mahaway in the Book of Giants. But anyway, he's told to go to him. He's sent there by the Oya and Haya and the others.
Mhm.
And here we find another kneeling figure. So he's kind of similar in that way. He almost has a little bit of similar looks to Oya and Haya. Maybe you'd presume one of the Gibberim, but he's at the top of a high tower. No other Book of Moses, no Book of Giants scholar I know of has identified this figure. But when you look at the story in the Book of Moses, and you look at the Book of Giants, why else would he be up there on a mountain if he were not praying in the fashion that we read about here? I'm just going to do a fly through, as it were, of this story. We have in the Book of Moses that in the canonical version, that it says, stood upon the place, Mahujah, and cried unto the Lord. But in the OT1, it says, as I was journeying and stood in the place, Mahujah and I cried unto the Lord. So it's as if that Mahujah and Enoch are praying together. And again, we have in the Book of Giants story, he's going east in the direction of the paradise of justice where Enoch lives. We have, corresponding to Mahway's second heavenly journey, we have again the Book of Moses where he's glorified, transfigured before the Lord. We have a roughly analogous story where Enoch, the words of Enoch come to Mahijah, who's now on earth, Mahaway, who's now on earth. The words of Enoch are coming down, and he's receiving a heavenly message that, and the only remnant of it that we have is from the Manichean remnants. I wish we had more of this part of the story, but he says basically to him, "O son of Virogdad," that's his father, who was a semi-divine personage, "I know this, you are like some of them." So when he says that, I take that to mean that he was too much like some of them. We don't have a whole lot of context. And after he gets that challenge to repent himself, after having flown to Enoch and being somewhat more responsive than the others, even to the extent of perhaps praying with them, he basically returns to his former ways. Oh, here it is, actually. I heard the voice of the apostle Enoch from the south. He was from the south, and he was definitely in a heavenly region. Very affectionately, he called out my name. This is Mahaway speaking. I shook or beat my wings. He was seen as a flying creature in the book of the giants, and quickly descended from heaven. He didn't want to stay there with Enoch, even though he'd been invited to go up to the mountain with him in the story of the Book of Moses. It conferred the account conferred the words of the apostle Enoch. It said, I call you a son of Verigdod. I know this. You are like some of them, which I take to being you are too much like some of them. He's saying it affectionately to him. And it almost reminds me of that story of Jesus and the rich young man where he says, I've kept all the commandments, and he's willing to go part way. And then Jesus asks him to do one more thing, and the man turns away. And Jesus, uh, it says it was sorrowful at that man's turning away. And that reminds me of the affection that's called out in this account as Mahaway apparently turns away.
Mhm.
Well, let's just continue with a couple other features of the story. The Gibborim are defeated in battle, and the one of the warriors in the Book of Giants says, "By my own arm and my strength, I went up against all flesh, and I made war against them, but did not prevail. For my opponents are angels who reside in heaven." Remember the four angels who are surrounding Enoch in that Book of Giants account. And they were not defeated, for they are stronger than I. And we have the Book of Moses, which says he led the people of God, and their enemies came to battle against them, and there went forth a curse upon all the people that fought against God.
Mhm.
And that verse actually does mention giants, the one place in the Book of Moses where it does. It says specifically that they stood afar off. Were you going to say something there, Stephen?
No, yeah. I'm just noticing the thematic sort of parallel there with the Gibberim being defeated in battle, both in the Book of Moses and Book of Giants.
Yeah. Divine protection, it said the people dwelled in righteousness and they were safe. They were wars and bloodsheds on the outer periphery of the drawing. And it said that the battle was terrible in the Book of Giants. The blood was shed like great rivers of the earth. Horrible picture.
Yeah, very violent.
And then it talks about the protection through the angels and others who moved Enoch out of their sight. So there is definitely some idea that they migrated. And then there's this strange phrase that come in there about in the Book of Moses that I just never knew what to do with in the Book of Moses. The roar of the lions, and I'm sure you remember this, Stephen, was
Hmm.
heard out of the wilderness during this battle, and all nations feared greatly. And then we have a corresponding thing in the Book of Moses. The blank of the wild beasts have come. But Stukenbrook and others take that to be the roar of the wild beasts have come, the roaring of the wild beasts in other translations, which is a pretty weird small parallel to the Book of Moses, which
It's quite
nowhere else
specific.
mentions was. Yeah, quite specific.
And
It's
both
quite,
are in the context of at the end of the battle.
yeah. And why would Joseph Smith have placed that thing about the roar of the lions was heard out of the wilderness? I mean, it's just such an extravagant addition. If you were just writing a little story about Enoch, it just seems completely out of place to us.
Yeah,
But here it is.
that's quite a specific mention. And also as well, I think you showed in our previous interview, and I read about this in your book, about the rivers of water being turned out of their course, and there being a
Yes,
similar passage, and I believe it was the Mandean account of Enoch referring to Enoch turning the waters out of their course. And I thought that was also quite a specific correlation.
I didn't show that here because I don't have a picture of that. I'd love to have a picture of that too. But you're right, in the Mandean thing, who would have thought? I mean, we think about mountains being moved and so forth. We hear about that in the New Testament, but nowhere in all of Scripture is there any report of rivers of water being turned out of their course, except in the Book of Moses and nowhere else but in the Enoch literature, the Mandean Enoch story about the book of about Enoch. So it's just pretty amazing.
Mm.
Okay, so let's take a look at this thing again and talk about the bigger picture. We have the righteous and wicked being separated. The accounts tell us the text accounts, we wouldn't know what to do with it if we only had the picture. But by marrying the text to the drawing, the wicked were said to have gone east, that is, further away from the sacred center. The righteous were said to have gone west toward the sacred center, as it were, towards the mountains, we read, both in the book of we read about in the book of Moses that they went to the mountains, which are the mountains at the base of the sacred mountain of Sumeru. And then we got at the top, we've got this interesting scene at the top of the mountains I mentioned. Those are definitely three gods there. We won't dissect this, but other scholars have done that. And then there's some attendants around the gods. You see notice to their pagoda there, and then you see all these dwelling places around them on the greenery of this tree. Now, Those are palaces on the heavenly mountain, divine figures. Yeah, I just said that. What is interesting is that the text talks about Enoch building cities with the righteous at the base in these mountains where the righteous have been gathered to the west. The picture doesn't show any cities down at the bottom in the mountains, but it does show palaces on the heavenly mountain
Hmm.
next to the divine figures. It shows as well, I think it's like one says 32 and one says 36. The number of palaces on the heavenly mountain more or less correspond to the number of cities that Enoch is said to have built in the Manichean text at the base of the mountain. Go ahead. What were you going to say, Stephen?
Oh, just in my mind, I was just thinking that almost implies that the cities seem to go up and somehow ascend up into heaven or into the sacred tree.
Don't we wish that either we had an animation on the drawing or a piece of the text that describes that? But it's kind of cool that we have the part A, which is they're in the mountains, the number of cities, the part C, that they're in the heavenly area with next to the gods, and then we're just missing part B about their heavenly ascent. But the Book of Moses is what tells us that they were taken to heaven, Enoch and all his people. Pretty cool puzzle pieces, as far as I'm concerned.
So we don't have any text that refers to that, but you're saying, with the part of the text that's missing and looking at the picture, that seems to be what is likely taking place.
That's right. We have A in the ground, the cities on the text. We have C that they're ascended to they are living next to the gods, and there's same number of places. And then Book of Moses fills in the blank.
Okay.
Okay. Well, let's see. I think we're getting close to the end here, and we've certainly. Oh, what about Mahaway's fate? Since this is centered around Mahway, what happened to him after he abandoned Enoch? And let me just read this. Yeah, going back to the story of Jesus' encounter with the rich young ruler, it says that he addressed him with affection and say, Mahaway, you're too much like one of them. He addressed him very affectionately. And then it seems that Mahaway ultimately sided with Enoch's wicked opponents and perished with them. What does the Book of Giants record? Let's get the actual words. Slain was that angel who was great, that messenger whom they had. Dead were those who joined with the flesh. I don't know why. I guess I got pretty close to Mahaway reading his story. I kind of get a little teary-eyed like I do with the rich young ruler when I think about he kind of came part way, but he turned back and he died with the other Gibborim because he didn't continue and accept the love and invitation of Enoch, if you believe this is a real story, which I'd kind of like to believe were true.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, final story about Nibley. Anything you'd like to say before we conclude here, Stephen, on this little piece?
No, I think that's an interesting summary, and this almost provides a little bit more that what's missing from the Book of Giants is what we get from these Manichean fragments, and this picture of the cosmology might even fill in some of the gaps that we're missing, and some things which are not explicit, but there's some implicit connections to what we see in the story of the Book of Moses with with the Mahujah giant almost being up on that mountain, and then the ascension of the cities into the heavenly mountain. I think it's quite interesting.
And it makes me also think when I think about Book of Moses having that backbone of history and then some little entertainment sequences, kind of reminds me of the Book of Mormon, where you have the large plates that contain more of the history of the people, and Nephi's plate that had the more of the sacred history.
Yeah.
And so here we have a little piece of the historic background. Oh, the battles, and Mahujah was ultimately slain, and that was left out of the Book of Moses because it
Hmm.
wasn't quite in line with the sacred record of the Book of Moses that we have
Hmm.
very selectively there. Again, interesting to think about. Well, let's just end then with Hugh Nibley. As I've reflected on the poignant death of Mahaway, I'm going to read this. Because I may not be able to get through it otherwise. I've been touched very deeply. I've been impressed with the thought that one never wants to leave this life without having accomplished his work on the earth. At one point in Hugh Nibley's life, He was given a patriarchal blessing, promising him that he would live to complete his work. His work on his final magnum opus, One Eternal Round, stretched from years into decades. He would sometimes say, half in jest, half in earnestness, that his delays in finishing the manuscript were what was keeping him alive. Finally, one day, to everyone's surprise, he seems to have been divinely persuaded to let some of his friends take dozens of boxes that contained overlapping manuscripts of the book. It seems that he had at last realized that this was not the unfinished work his life had been prolonged to complete, but rather that it was something else, something very different. His friend Louis Midgley recounts the following incident. Quote, Phyllis, his wife, called me and urged me to visit her husband. I did. And we talked. Hugh was in a hospital bed. He could hardly speak. He'd mumble and we'd talk back and forth. We talked a bit about New Zealand and the Maori. Since he'd heard that I'd been to Normandy, he wanted to know if I'd visited what's called Exit 5 on Utah Beach and what I thought of the whole miserable mess. Soon 2 Relief Society sisters knocked on the door. They'd brought him dinner. They rushed over and hugged him and kissed him, and he just wept. When they left, Phyllis asked me, Did you notice that? I said, Yes, I did, said Lou Midgley. Have you ever seen my husband show emotion? I answered, No, never. Phyllis said that he couldn't show emotion, but when he was reduced to lying there, hardly able to talk, he would say to her, Phyllis, I've been kept after school by the Lord, so I could learn a lesson that I needed to learn before I pass away. Shirley Ricks then recounts, Brother Nibley said he didn't sleep a wink last night, and he knew where he was going and what the purpose of everything was. Brent Hall, who was there, ventured to ask, So, Brother Nibley, can you share with us what that purpose is? He paused and replied, Joy. He then went on to explain that the glory of God is intelligence, that we have great intelligence when we pass on, and that intelligence allows us to solve problems, which in turn brings us joy. He told us not to worry a minute about what was going to happen after this life. He's actually looking forward to it. He said at one point, I could go this evening or even tomorrow. He sounded very pleased with the prospect. End of quote. May we finish our mission on the earth as faithfully as did Enoch and Hugh Nibley and receive that joy is my prayer. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen. That was really beautiful and touching. Oh, thanks for sharing that there at the end. I think this has been a really wonderful and thorough episode. Do you mind if I just ask you 1 or 2 final questions in wrapping up, and then that'll be it, sort of in totality of everything that we've covered today. Will that be okay? Oh, hold on. I seem to lose Jeff there. Some internet issues. If he's not able to come back on, I'm just going to give an outro. I think this has been probably more of a complex and technical episode, especially diving into some of the arguments for and against the Mahujah Mahway connection. And I'm very tentative when we get into topics like linguistics because this is really beyond me. But I have really appreciated this episode with Jeff for all the research that he's done. I do find the correspondences between Joseph's Enoch and other Enochic pseudepigrapha to be quite striking. I think some are very specific correspondences. There's some parallels and thematic correspondences as well. And I think it points to that maybe Joseph was tapping into revelation and channeling ancient concepts in the ancient tradition about Enoch. And I personally find all of the ancient connections I see, probably the Mahujah Mahaway, both the name and the role, being one of the strongest correspondences, which is difficult to account for as just coincidence, and to say that all of these are just loose parallels as well. I'm hoping to do a few episodes myself on the Book of Enoch at some point, and to utilize a lot of the work and scholarship that Jeff Bradshaw has done. And again, I'll just recommend people to buy his book, Enoch and the Gathering of Zion. And again, if you really appreciate the time and the work that I put into my channel and to my content and the interviews and the great guests that I have on, you can, one of the best ways to support is to like, share, and comment on all my videos to help with the algorithms as well. Trying to share on any social media, or if you're on Reddit, just to spread the word and grow the channel. And And also as well, if you would be able to donate, you can do it via PayPal or Patreon or channel memberships as well, and things like that to support the channel. But thanks everyone for watching this episode. Jeff's unable to come back on, I'm afraid, but I think it's been a really thorough interview nonetheless, and I'll see you next time on Mormonism with Murph. Mormonism with Murph. Take care. Bye.